Go ahead, Manu.
Are you comfortable with the protests that we saw outside the homes of Supreme Court justices over the weekend?
If protests are peaceful, yes. My house there's protests 3-4 times a week outside my house. That's the American way to peacefully protest is okay. And that's my wife, sorry. Maybe there's a protest outside. Go ahead, Manu.
Are you comfortable with protests?
Manu.
Can we appreciate that Chuck Schumer has a flip-top cell phone? I mean, that on an ordinary day would be the most offensive thing about what we just watched. I'm joking about the flip-top people. Some people think that those phones are more reliable and less invasive than the evil iPhone. I want people to appreciate what we just witnessed here. This is a senator doing nothing shy of encouraging or sanctioning in the sense of authorizing, condoning what is an outright criminal action. Just listen. Do you have any problem with the protests, was the question, that are going on in front of, I think it's Alito's house? Listen to what Schumer says.
Are you comfortable with the protests that we saw outside the homes?
Are you comfortable with the protests going on outside Alito's home, I believe?
Protests are peaceful, yes. My house there's protests 3-4 times a week outside my house.
If the protests are peaceful, well, Chuck Schumer, you have just encouraged people to commit a federal crime. And don't trust me because I'm just a schnook Canadian in his basement talking to a camera behind which there are lots of people. We talked about this yesterday. It's a crime. Black on white letter of the law. Now, I don't know if it's equally as illegal in front of a senator's house. We're going to see what this provision of law says. But when Chuck Schumer compares protesting on the front lawn of a sitting judge's house, his home, while he's in the process of rendering a decision, obviously for the purposes of influencing or affecting that judge, the decision that judge is in the process of rendering, I don't know if this provision of law would also apply to doing that to a senator, but let's go see, shall we? It's 18 USC section 1507, picketing or parading. Whoever with the intent of interfering with, obstructing, or impeding the administration of justice, or with the intent of influencing any judge, juror, witness, or court officer in the discharge of his duty, pickets or parades in or near a building housing a court of the United States, or in or near a building or residence occupied by such a judge, juror, witness, or court officer, or with such intent uses any sound truck or similar device, or resorts to any demonstration in or near any such building or residence, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year, or both. So as far as I'm concerned, Chuck Schumer, your analogy is legally not analogous, because I don't think you're a judge, jury, or officer of the court and anyone's picketing on your front lawn to, what was the purpose of it? Where did it say for the purposes of? What's my problem? Oh, yeah, sorry. With the intent of impeding the administration of justice. Now, do bear in mind, obstruction of Congress, which is what they went with full force against everyone on January 6th and their grandmother, literally. They went full force on that. But when it comes to this specific provision of law that specifically prohibits picketing or parading at the residence of a judge for the purposes of interfering with that decision, it's a specific, overt, codified criminal act, and you have a senator, a sitting senator, saying he's okay with it. Cool, no biggie. Just go harass judges outside their homes. Oh, if it's peaceful harassment, if it's peaceful picketing, that's not what the law says, Schumer. And so you are a sitting senator encouraging people to go break the law. I accidentally tweeted that he should be impeached, but I don't think senators can be impeached. I think they can just be expelled. Just imagine the world in which we're living, where Trump giving a speech at Capitol Hill telling people to peacefully protest, fight like hell for the country, peacefully protest impeached by I think by the same, was it by the same Senate? No. But you get Schumer actively saying, if it's peaceful, go break the law. Mostly illegal. Mostly peaceful, but totally illegal protest. Schumer should be expelled. He should be censured. There should be political consequences for what Schumer is doing. It is sanctioning an outright assault on the judicial system itself at the highest level. And just a little bit of interesting tidbit. Sanction is the one language in one of the few words in the English language which means both one thing and the exact opposite. To sanction is to penalize, to sanction is to authorize. All right, now with that said, people, I'm going to go. I started early tonight because I wanted to bring on a special guest before the Sidebar special guest. And I don't want to say that one is more special than the other, because they're not. Everyone is equally special. Everyone, as my father says, is a snowflake. In the sense of being unique, not in the sense of being a fragile little thing that dissipates under the slightest aspect of heat. But no, we got an interesting guest before the sidebar guest, Tyson Hockley. Canadians might know who he is. He's a 14-year-old kid. I think he's 14. 14-year-old kid who has been live streaming the Ottawa protests as they occurred, or as you know, the sister protests occurred in British Columbia. Has been discovering the internet, discovering his voice, discovering his fighting spirit. We're going to get there in 2 minutes because he's backstage, and I want to have a discussion before we go live with Michael Tracy, journalist at 7 o'clock. Going to be fascinating. Very much following the outrageous debacle that is the $40 billion pledge of military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, while there is literally a baby formula shortage in the United States. But priorities. First things first, super chats such as this one. Notice his wife has his burner number and not his real number. Brit, the internet is smart, man. I wouldn't. That is very interesting, funny observation. I'm watching. Good. So what was I about to say? Oh yeah, no. Super chats. 30% goes to YouTube. If you don't like that, we are simultaneously streaming on Rumble, where they have Rumble Rants. Rumble takes 20%. So it's better to support the creator there, better to support a platform that actually supports free speech, even if it means standing up to the powers that would have them or try to have them not run movies like 2,000 Mules, not give a platform to Russian disinformation like RT. They are fighting the good fight at Rumble, so you might want to contemplate supporting them. If I don't bring your super chat up and it's going to make you upset, don't give it. I don't like people being... no, dementia is not setting in, for goodness sake. It's just called having too many things on my mind. If I don't bring up your super chat and it's going to make you angry, don't give the super chat. I do my best to bring them all up, but I'm not going to get them all up. And if they say something I don't want to bring up, I reserve the right not to bring them up. Okay, with that said, Tyson Hockley. Couldn't have a better Canadian name if you wanted it. It's like hockey with the hockey stick L in it. Tyson, I'm bringing you in. You ready, man?
Hey, Viva.
How you doing?
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. How about you?
Tyson, it's the world is crazy. The world is fortuitous. I'm in Ottawa, there for the Rolling Thunder protest, the Rolling Thunder rally. Somebody says, dude, you have to check out Tyson Hockley. I've never heard of you. Went to see what you're doing. It's great. If I wish I were doing such productive things when I was 14 instead of what I was doing when I was 14, tell the world who you are.
Yeah, so my name's Tyson Hockley, 14-year-old, and I have a passion for doing YouTube. And I've been going out to in Victoria, BC, downtown every single Saturday. They have a freedom rally down there. And I've kind of made it a commitment to try to get out there as much as possible. And what I do is I go to these rallies and I just fire up a live stream. I'm just a kid with a camera.
Let me ask you, I mean, how you got into it because you saw what was going on in Ottawa, or did you get into YouTube earlier on than that?
So I've had my channel for like 3 years now. So this kind of streaming the freedom rallies is kind of like a new era for my channel. But yeah, I remember my mom like pointed it out. It was on the news, like the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. So I kind of did my research, and it seemed interesting, and I saw a lot of people were interested in it. So I had the idea to go down there and just live stream, just try it out. I wasn't really expecting much to come from it. I was expecting, yeah, maybe there'll be a few people down at the legislature, maybe a handful of people I'll live stream. And I end up getting downtown, and there's 10,000 people at the legislature in Victoria.
That's so. I mean, actually, just to stop you there, Victoria. Now, for those of you who don't know, Victoria is quite left-leaning as far as politics goes. If I'm not mistaken, this is Victoria, BC, which is Tabarnouche, Vancouver Island. Is it on Vancouver Island?
Yeah.
Jeez, I drew a blank for a second. I didn't want to look too totally stupid. It's a pretty left-ish culture, is it not?
Think so.
And without giving too much away, you're born and raised in Victoria?
Yeah.
How many siblings?
I'm an only child.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. What do your parents do?
So my mom works at a dental office, and my dad works for the government.
Okay. And now, do you not have the risk of do your parents say, stop doing this? We don't want you getting involved in this. Are they supportive of what you're doing?
No, they're very supportive. My mom actually let me have the day off school today, because in Victoria at the Supreme Court, there was a challenge to the BC vaccine passport. And I was able to go down there today instead of going to school and kind of do like a live little Twitter update on what was going on. And I met some people, reporters at Rebel News. And it was just kind of a fun experience. But my mom did have a deal that if I wanted to have the day off school, I had to complete all my homework last night, which I did. But yeah, it's a lot of fun today. I got to meet Drea Humphrey from Rebel News and Matt Brevner from Rebel News. And they actually interviewed me afterwards too, which is amazing.
That's fantastic. Only child means you get a lot of attention from your parents. Is that right?
Yeah, a ton.
When did you start this the YouTube venture?
So it was kind of like in quarantine, like mid-pandemic, kind of like the first couple months of the pandemic. My baseball just got canceled, which I said on Live from the Sheds interview. But baseball is like my main thing. I've been working 3 years preparing for a tournament that we were hosting. So when that got canceled, everything kind of went crashing down for me. I didn't really have much to do. And of course, cut off from my friends because there's social distancing and all that at the start. So I've always kind of thought about doing YouTube. So this is kind of a perfect opportunity for me to start it up and kind of just see where it would go. And I started off with really stupid stuff. Like I did a 24-hour challenge on my roof. I did a 24-hour challenge in my tent trailer, just like silly stuff. But I had a ton of fun with it. It was after I did my first YouTube video that I realized this is what I want to do. And 3 years later, here I am streaming the freedom rallies, and I'm still loving every second of it.
So when you say the 24-hour challenge was on YouTube, this is when you're first just discovering the platform and doing. So you stayed on your roof for 24 hours and you streamed it.
Yeah.
What was the? What was the viewership? What were you talking about for 24 hours, man?
So I was just kind of did like an update every half an hour, like here I am on the roof eating a granola bar and stuff like that. My parents were in on it, like they knew I was on the roof, and even if they weren't in on it, they'd probably hear me walking around up there. But I got my dad to actually come in at the end of the video and act all like surprised and angry. So he had a little cameo in that video.
It's obviously a flat roof. It's not an A-frame shaped
no,
roof.
it's flat. Yeah.
Now, jokes aside, you're 14 when this pandemic started. You're 12 years old. I don't even know how you're going to contextualize this or remember it in retrospect. I mean, what does it feel like? You're an only child. What happens in Victoria when all of the poop hits the fan? When they 2 weeks to flatten the curve. What did that start off like? And what did that? I mean, how did that impact you?
It was a really weird vibe. Like everybody was scared, including myself. At like the first month. Like I said, baseball got shut down, school got shut down, and I don't know. It felt like one of those apocalyptic movies. Like it felt like I was in a movie. Like it was surreal, hard to explain, kind of. Coming from a 12-year-old at that time. Of course, it was kind of fun having school shut down. I was able to have a lot of free time, but that gets old after a couple months of not being able to see your friends. But yeah, it was almost like my whole world got flipped upside down because I'd been working so hard at baseball. And that had been kind of my whole life, is just friends and baseball, friends and baseball. So to have those two things out of nowhere just ripped from you, um, I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. It was really weird.
And so, friends in baseball, which is the life of a 12-year-old, and then it goes to no baseball and
Mhm.
basically no friends. I mean, were you? Don't want to get you in trouble. Were you breaking the rules? Were you having sleepovers, or was this like you're not seeing friends, and if you do, it's outside, and everybody's totally freaking out and staying 6 feet apart?
Well, I still kept in touch with some of my friends. We'd do this thing called squishy ball, which is like baseball but with a squishy ball. We kind of made up like our own little game, and we'd all get together and play that. I had like a couple sleepovers like later into everything, but yeah, not really much. Like it went from seeing my friends every single day to like seeing my friends maybe once a week, maybe twice a week.
And how long was school shut down for?
School got shut down like spring break, like the end of spring break, and then it was shut down for the rest of the year. So what is that? Like 5, 6? Actually, I don't
So
know.
it's like basically it's a full year and a half.
hmm
And you have school online. How did that work for you guys up in Victoria?
So we did. We had school online, but nobody did it. My parents made me do it, but none of my friends actually did it. And what they'd do is they'd post like what you have to do for the next 4 weeks, but it was like nothing because they didn't expect kids to actually do it. So I'd log on and I'd do like all 4 weeks of work in one day, and then I'd have 4 weeks off. Um,
One of my kids just came in here. You want to say hi or no? No, he does. He doesn't want to say hi. I got a kid who came. He found me in the basement. I'm going to be live for like 2.5 hours. You might want to go back upstairs. He wants to go biking. Ask mom. Go ask mom. She'll take it. Go. Yeah, so it's a full year lost of school. Did you? I mean, it's going to be a ridiculous thing, but do the children appreciate or do they recognize that they basically did not get an education for that year? Like, is it an inside joke, or do some people think this is how easy it's going to be going forward?
I think like most of my friends were pretty pumped. Some of my friends still say that when school got shut down, that was like the best moment of their lives. Cause I mean, like it's kind of just typical. Kids don't like going to school. But like I said, after like a couple months of no school, it got old. For sure. It's definitely a lot better being back. Now it's a full normal year. There's no masks anymore, no cohorts. So it's just like a normal year now, which is nice. Um, but yeah, it was kind of nice having school shut down and having
Now,
all that
let me
extra
ask you.
free time.
Don't want to ask a loaded question because I know the way I feel about this. But have you noticed among any of your friends any lingering? I'll call it trauma. Have any of your friends had a difficult time? If so, I mean, what sort of anecdotes can you share of your direct experiences with people who didn't necessarily cope all that well with the last 2.5 years of this?
From what I've experienced, most of my friends have coped pretty well. Most of them are over it by now. Like it wasn't that great of an inconvenience for some of them. Some of them actually enjoyed the experience. Like I said, I wouldn't say that there's any like trauma um from it, but yeah, everybody's just happy to be back to normal from what I've
Okay.
observed.
Very cool. Now, so let's now getting back into the YouTube stuff. So you start off, as does everybody. Someone in the chat said, Viva, you started off doing squirrel videos. That was actually late. I started off running obstacle course races in a business suit and tie, full jacket, lip syncing pop songs. If anyone hasn't seen that, go look up Wrecking Spartan for full cringe. But you find your way. So how did you get into this? You go one day, you go down to Victoria and there's 10,000 people and you're live streaming and you're like, this is the coolest thing on earth.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, part of doing YouTube is you have to provide content that people actually care about and that people actually want to watch. And before I started streaming this, I had like a couple thousand followers, and my videos would get like 100 views or something. And then I fire up this live stream, and I had like 200 people watching. So I'm like, okay, I found what people want to watch. Now it's just a matter of continuing to produce this type of content. And I also enjoyed it. It was fun. I love getting down there and live streaming. It's a highlight of my weekend sometimes when I don't have baseball, just getting down there and live streaming. But it was really from seeing how many people actually have a hunger for that content, because there's not many streamers in Victoria. There's Vic BC Live, Tie Guy 266, or a couple. But it's just me and them pretty much. So I also kind of feel an obligation to get down there and stream, because without me and without the other streamers I just mentioned, then nobody even knows what's going on. But yeah,
I actually didn't know it was quite so big in Victoria. So every week they have a protest.
hmm
And
sometimes they like do a little convoy up island, so there's a smaller group at the legislature. But yeah, every week. And I also want to mention one thing. So We Unify Canada as an organization, they saw us going on your show. They wanted me to mention this. So Saturday, May 28th, there's an event in Victoria, and they have guest speakers Brian Peckford, Roman Baber, Dr. Roger Hodkinson, and Dr. Eric Payne are speaking at that event.
okay, I just had Roman Baber on.
Yeah, I saw
last week.
Mhm.
It's great. And have you run into Brian Peckford?
So he was at the very first event that I streamed, but he hasn't been back since. So he's coming back May 28th, and I'm thinking about trying to get an interview with him. I'm not sure the logistics behind that, but I want to interview him. I have some questions lined up. So it's just kind of a matter of how everything unfolds. But yeah, that is my plan. But
Okay, so now tell me this, because when they had the protest in Ottawa, they brought in the police. It ended up very badly. I mean, I presume you saw that on the interwebs. What have the protests been like in Vancouver or in Victoria? Have they been by and large peaceful, or how are the police responding to it? Are the people getting arrested, getting ticketed? What's the overall ambiance?
it's pretty peaceful. There's a couple arrests, and they banned honking. So anybody honking was subject to $150 ticket. I'm not sure how many of those have been issued, because there's always people honking. So the police would be kind of busy getting every single vehicle. I'm not sure how they'd track down every single vehicle, because there's a whole bunch of them. But yeah, by and large, it's been peaceful. I haven't really seen any violence. I was on the bus one time. I saw somebody getting arrested. So it is happening. But no, it seems pretty peaceful from what I've observed.
Now, do people at your school know who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah.
Has there been any blowback there? Because I look in the education system, it tends to be certainly, politically or ideologically aligned in a certain way. Have you noticed any flack, pushback, or what you might think is unfair treatment from teachers who might not like what you're standing up for?
I haven't, because all I do is I just kind of point my camera at the crowd. When I'm there, I never say any of my own beliefs, because here's the thing. Here's what I think is wrong with media nowadays. Media either caters to the right side of the political spectrum, or they cater to the left. And I don't feel like enough people are just going there and sharing both sides. So I just don't know why they can't show both sides of the argument. And that's what my channel is. And I feel like that's why people follow me, is because they see both sides. So no, I haven't received any unfair treatment. Actually, one of my teachers said that they heard my name mentioned on the local radio and he thought that was cool. But yeah, just do non-biased reporting, just there with my camera. And I let people make up their own mind. I don't tell people what to think. I let them think their own thoughts, and I kind of just let them see everything that's going on.
Yeah. I've been told I use bad lighting to stay humble. I thought I was using good lighting, but and I don't look. If I looked gaunt, I got off the treadmill shortly before this stream, and I think I'm still sweating a little bit. But Tyson, first of all, so it's fantastic. Have you had any close calls, any odd encounters? Have you had anybody who, doesn't like the fact that you're staying neutral? A lot of people say, to stay neutral in the face of evil is to participate in that evil. And then, you get both people on both sides saying that about your staying neutral to the other side. Have you had any unpleasant encounters or odd pushback?
So there's two. So one time I was at the rally and somebody yelled at me, "You're broadcasting a fascist organization." That's what he said, something along those lines. And I also got flipped off one time at a protest by one of the counter protesters. And when I tried to explain to him that I'm just neutral reporter, he asked me how much YouTube's paying me. And then he said, "You're better off working at McDonald's." That's what he said. And then he flipped me off. But those are the two kind of negative experiences.
That individual is wrong on both counts. That better to work. Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with working at McDonald's. It's how you learn how to work, and it's how you learn how to be responsible. But yeah, It's amazing. Did you try to engage with that counter protester?
I said to him that I'm a neutral reporter, and I said I'm showing both sides, and he didn't want to hear it, and then he just flipped me off, walked away, and then that's the last I ever heard of that guy. But I never let anything like that get me down because, of course, if anybody successful ever listened to haters, then they wouldn't get anywhere.
Well,
So I just remain positive and keep enjoying myself out there. Yeah.
with Viva, when you're interviewing someone, please act in. Okay, I hope this is sarcastic. This had better be sarcastic. Okay, sorry, I got distracted. That had better be sarcastic. Tyson, now I got totally distracted. Yeah, what you might find at one point in time, both sides are going to want to know your opinion. As far as all of this goes, I'm not even going to ask you your opinion. But what has been your assessment of what's going on from what you've seen? What's your assessment of the state of Canada at this point in time?
Assessment of the state of Canada. That's a deep question.
As a 14-year-old, I won't call you a kid. You're 14 years old. People want to know what I was doing when I was 14. Not this live stream. Do you feel that Canada is a free country from the perspective of a 14-year-old, very mature individual?
That's kind of a tough question. Yes and no. Yes and no in a sense that, I mean, I don't know. How could I answer this question with staying neutral? I'm trying to think.
I think here's what you might find at some point in time is that it might be impossible to remain neutral, in that even neutrality itself will be accused of being a form of bias. But I'll take you off the spot on that question. Do you have any are you thinking of getting into politics in any way, shape, or form?
I have thought of it. It does interest me. I always have people commenting Tyson for a prime minister and stuff like that. Not overly, but I don't know. I wouldn't rule it out completely. Getting into politics. I am, of course, more politically interested than most kids. But not like politics is my life or anything. But I'm not going to rule it out in the future. I may pursue politics, perhaps. I guess we'll kind of just have to wait and see. But if I do choose to, it's going to be nice because I kind of have a head start, whereas I already have like a platform here on YouTube of supporters.
And this is going to be the biggest question for you now. You've seen what the public wants. You know, it fluctuates and it evolves over time. And like a lot of the streamers who were born out of the Ottawa protests and streamed, when they end, the question is, what do you transition to? You know, when the protests, when this all passes over, what do you envision your channel transitioning into in terms of content, in terms of, you know, on the one hand, giving people what they're interested in, but on the other hand, also following what you're interested in?
So I don't know. I've been inspired by what you do, and what Dave does live from the shed, interviewing people, and I honestly think I'm gonna try to pursue that. I of course got to get better at interviewing people. I also want to pursue like journalism. Like when big stuff is happening, I want to be the guy informing people what's going on. But I definitely see myself doing something similar to what you do, as like just having people on, hearing their story, and just kind of letting them talk. I could definitely see that being something that I do. Of course, though, I gotta think of questions, and it's kind of just a matter of getting used to interviewing people. But yeah, I could definitely see myself doing what you do, in terms of just doing these live streams with guests and all that.
All right, man. Now I see our second guest of the evening, or our first guest, Michael Tracy, a journalist. Tyson, you're going to want to stick around and watch this because you look like you're interested in journalism. You sound like you're interested in journalism. You actually sound like you have a very, very firmly attached head, which is I think uncommon for a 14-year-old, but maybe I've just forgotten what it means. If you have to read a book on journalism, read James O'Keefe's The American Muckraker. It's phenomenal, and if you listen to it, it's on audio as well. Where can people find you? And Yeah, where can people find you? And I'll post the links to the pinned comments when we're done.
So first of all, I just want to say every 1,000 subscribers, my mom gets me a cake, and we're getting kind of close to 8,000. Just hit 7,000. So hopefully we can maybe get another cake and put my mom to work. But you can find me on YouTube, Twitter, Rumble, Facebook, kind of all social media platforms for the most part under the username Tyson Hockley.
Well, it's the way it's spelled right there. Hockey with an L.
Yeah.
Tyson, enjoy it. You're doing phenomenal stuff. I mean, I was watching a lot of your streams, and I was just thinking, like, dude, you're 14. You found something interesting. You found something amazing. You're making money doing it. You're providing something useful to the world that the world wants, and you're passionate about it, and it's going to be amazing. So, Tyson Hockley on YouTube. Are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter. Yeah, today from the courthouse I was providing live tweets. I don't really have that big of a following on Twitter. But just like everything, trying to build it up.
Like,
can I give a
Casey
shout out to somebody real quick?
Please go for it.
Okay, so the person who came up to you in Ottawa and told you about me, his name is Coda B123. Nothing but love and respect for him. He does a lot to promote me, and I just want to mention him on here. It's all one word, so it's like Cotab123. Just wanted to mention him, and give a little shout out and show my appreciation to him.
All right, let's see this have some impact. People, check him out. The links will be pinned, and when I get a chance, I'm actually going to go pin in the comment of the live chat your channel. Tyson, keep up the good work. And like Winston Churchill said, if you stop to throw a stone at every barking dog, you'll never get to where you're going. So you look like you appreciate that already. Tyson, we'll keep in touch, and we'll see. We'll be in touch in the future.
Thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure, man. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Well, that was interesting. In this one day, people, during an AMA, I will tell the world what I was doing when I was 14 years old. But let's just say I went to 3 high schools in 5 years. I'm going to get to a few super chats before I bring in Michael Tracy, because I see him in the background. Unv Cadet marked, I heard of this story. Held behind fence, removed from activities. Also, Tim Hortons deny Unv kids to join summer camp. Shed following up. I've heard about that story, the marking on the hand. I know that Tim Hortons is imposing that requirement. Atrocious. Stupid stuff like GoPro scroll videos sounds familiar somehow. The transition looks like it's there. This kid he's on to good things much earlier and can learn from the mistakes of others without having to make them himself. Other auto antonyms: weather, seated, dusted, off, left, cleave, oversight. Very interesting. Guy, you are broadcasting a fascist organization. Proper response: good. The world should know they are fascist or not. Touche, Britt Cormier. That I would like. If someone's saying something stupid, don't suppress their speech. Give them a bullhorn. Instead of going into politics, play piano in a brothel. You'll be far less likely to lose your soul. All right, one more. Are you going to pursue a baseball career, Tyson? Darn it. Well, we'll see. We'll see. He might have a more of a political career before anything. Smart kid, great kid. And now we are on to Michael Tracy, a journalist that I think Tyson is going to have a good time listening to, because Mike is doing. We're going to have some very substantive political. What's the word I'm looking for? Policy discussion tonight. It's going to be amazing. Michael, I'm going to bring you in. Barnes, I'm going to bring you in. We're going to work on the order here. Mike, how's it going?
Going pretty well. How about you?
Okay, good. That hesitation, I thought I might have been in trouble for some
Well,
reason.
I was considering whether I wanted to make like a excessively clever, sort of snippy introductory remark, but then I just went for this generic greeting.
And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this way, and I'm going to put myself on the bottom so I cover my own face with super chats. All right, dude, here we go. And Robert, how are you doing?
Good.
All right, gentlemen, where do we start here? Now, this Michael, I mean, I'm familiar with your stuff. I haven't been following you on Twitter for all that long, but you're
How dare you?
So, well, no, it takes time to learn all these things. It's like, although I know that I've seen your tweets before I started following you. We're going to get into the Ukrainian stuff that you're covering thoroughly, but elevator pitch for people who don't know who you are before we get into the beginning to get into the present.
Who am I? Where have I come from? Where am I going? These are the age-old questions. Does that count as a response? I don't know. I'm a journalist. I have a Substack, mtracy.substack.com. Also write for a variety of other publications here and there throughout the years. And I do, different media stuff, audio, video, the whole kit and caboodle for the contemporary journalistic endeavor that I'm embarked upon.
Well, when I ask where you're from, I mean like actually quite more literally.
Oh, where am I from?
Raised and siblings, what your parents do, childhood.
Okay. I'm from New Jersey. I've bounced around the U.S., but I actually now live in Jersey City, so a different part of New Jersey from where I grew up. I grew up in North Jersey, Essex County, New Jersey. Heavily Irish, Italian, and Jewish enclave. So I have always sort of regarded myself as a customary Jew, even though I don't happen to be Jewish. Most people assume that I'm Jewish, which I actually consider to be a great honor. I guess maybe due to my mannerisms and my self-deprecation. You asked about my childhood.
Well, how many siblings? And what did your parents?
How many
do?
siblings? Oh, geez. I have 2 siblings. I'm the oldest of 3. Do people really want to know about my family composition?
I only like to know, to see, did you come from a traditionally Democrat background, a traditionally conservative background?
Oh, okay. I would say not an overly political background one way or another in terms of my familial upbringing. I would say my parents were kind of just generic, soft Democrats. If anything, as I became more politically conscientious, they seemed to adopt more and more of my views rather than the other way around. Actually, my paternal grandfather, who died in the 60s, ran for a local office in New Jersey, like a town council, as a Democrat. But he was a ethnic Irish politician at the time. So basically, if you were a Republican, you would have had to be in certain circles that were dominated by the kind of WASP type. So it was more kind of ethnically sorted at that time, more so than even ideologically sorted. There are obviously ideological dimensions. But yeah, I do have a paternal grandfather who was in the middle of running for local office as a Democrat when he died suddenly in a freak accident. But whether that has any effect on my political sense of self, I'm not sure. I guess I'd have to hire a very smart psychotherapist to really uncover those hidden truths if they really exist.
Now, you were part of the sort of the millennial generation in part that, like Obama 2008, that brought in a lot of young people. There was a lot of excitement, hope and change, that he could make a real difference. For my generation, that was Bill Clinton in 1992. We were disabused of it rather quickly, some of us. But can you recall that for people? Because that was really legitimate. In other words, people on the right didn't quite understand it because it didn't apply to them in the same way. But there really was a lot of enthusiasm for Obama that faded kind of quickly. Like by 2012, it wasn't there. But can you describe both the idealism of what Obama 2008 represented and then the disappointment that it didn't quite translate like people hoped it would?
Well, yeah, the 2008 presidential cycle was my first as, a conscious adult with my own, at least, inchoate political views and, ideological maybe affiliation, or, had the beginnings of it developing at that time. And so, yeah, I did. I was very invested in the Obama campaign, both in the primaries and the general election. I did a lot of volunteer work for both the primary and the general election campaign, which, regardless of how that transpired in terms of Obama's legacy or his tenure in office or what policies he did or did not successfully implement, it is very illuminating and educational to participate in politics in that way, which I wouldn't do now probably because I'm in more of a journalistic capacity, right? But at the time when I was just sort of a private citizen, 18, 19, 20 years old, it was pretty formative because, especially if you're doing canvassing, you're going around and talking to people directly who are from different walks of life, who you would probably not ordinarily otherwise encounter. And so those experiences, I think, are even helpful for me. Were helpful for me even in giving me sort of a journalistic bug in a way, because you're almost going around doing anthropology, right, and synthesizing it and trying to extrapolate from it. One of the lessons one of the key anecdotes that I took away from that, and when I say I worked for the Obama campaign in a volunteer capacity, I mean I was actually full bore. I went into the New Jersey state headquarters regularly and did just office work. I had traveled to New Hampshire during the primaries and spent like a week canvassing, and I did phone banking. I registered voters everywhere that I could for the New Jersey primaries and then the general election. So I was pretty deeply committed, more so than anybody I knew. Maybe not just in the Obama campaign, but in electoral politics writ large. Because, back then, before everything was hyper politicized, I mean, I guess maybe you had certain initial inklings that things were getting hyper politicized, but nowhere near what happened under Trump. Back then, it wasn't like considered particularly cool or fashionable to be that invested in politics. And you were somewhat weird or against the grain if you were that involved one way or another. But, I was just going to say, one of the anecdotes that's really stuck with me was from the general election period, maybe 2 weeks or so prior to the election in November 2008. And I don't know that I would have believed that this species of person really existed unless I firsthand experienced it, right? But I was canvassing in North Philadelphia in one of the ethnic white neighborhoods, right? So in North Philadelphia, you have these legacy kind of Irish and Italian enclaves. And I went around and was canvassing, and I knocked on one door, and a younger woman came out, and I just asked them how they're voting. The idea is you develop a rapport with the person that you've contacted. And she called into her mother, who was this elderly woman sitting inside. And she said, I asked, because they were on a list of Democrats, like you're going around doing get out the vote, essentially, and trying to spur Democrats to make sure that they actually go vote. And the elderly woman sitting inside shouted out, "I don't vote for N-words." And then they invited me in to speak. So I went, okay. So I go and I speak to the woman. It's an older white woman. And I said, so, if that's your position, who are you going to vote for? Because she's not a Republican. She's not going to vote for John McCain, presumably. And she said, I'm going to vote for Obama. And I said, wait, what do you mean? And she said, I'm going to vote for the white half. So, I mean, that was a real thing. I mean, that's a thing
that's
that, like,
Philadelphia, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have encountered a person like that in any other scenario. So just to know that person existed was,
Michael, I got to ask a question, which is almost, it's going to sound like a joke, but is this like when she said, "I don't vote for N-words," was it a hard R or a soft R? Like, is it Blazing Saddles type pronunciation?
It was a hard R. It was a hard R. And it wasn't even like, it was weird as far, like, my recollection is she wasn't even saying it. I mean, I didn't get the sense that tonally she was trying to express animosity. It was almost just like a statement of fact, right? It was just what she wouldn't do. She was just trying to relay that to me, almost like this matter of fact way. But yeah, that's what she said.
You said ethnic white, and I've got to ask you what that means.
Maybe that is sort of like an overly general term. I guess I'm just talking about, particularly in the Northeast, where you have Irish and Italian kind of neighborhoods that came in from that wave of immigration in the early 20th century. Maybe ethnic whites isn't the best term for that, but that's just kind of what I associated with, more so than like, Scots Irish from the founding of the country, which you would find in like Appalachia or something.
So, I mean, it goes to show, like, I guess politics trumps race then. So this individual who's a registered Democrat, and I'm not drawing any broader conclusions like all Democrats are racist, whatever, but this person's a registered Democrat, says what she says, that still says, "I'm voting Democrat anyhow. I'll just find a way to convince myself that I'm voting for the what I consider to be the good part of this individual and not the part that I don't like.
Yeah.
That's it's
It's
interesting.
interesting because actually, when I did that canvassing, it convinced me that politically speaking, Obama's selection of Biden as vice president was actually very smart. I mean, the kind of conventional wisdom when Biden was first selected was that Obama picked him because he had foreign policy gravitas, right? That he had this elder statesman vibe, and Obama was this young and maybe inexperienced candidate, and that would be counteracted by Biden as this foreign policy whiz who'd been around the bend and who had been involved in all kinds of international issues. And when I did this canvassing, I actually heard from people who might, because this was an area that went strongly for Hillary Clinton in the primaries, right? Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton won the Pennsylvania primary in, I think it was April or May of 2008. And then that really extended the primary season much longer than it might have otherwise gone. I don't know if you recall, but it went down to the wire essentially. I mean, Obama was always ahead in the delegate math, but Hillary dragged it out until the final contest in June of 2008. And one of the big rationale she had for why to continue campaigning was that she won the Pennsylvania primary in part on the strength of voters like this person in the Philadelphia area. But what I heard from people in these areas that might have not been that enthused about Obama is that Biden did give them a sense of reassurance about, because they're like, they're like Kennedy Democrats, that's where they came of age. And just that Biden aura of this kind of, rollicking Irish American ethnic white kind of persona gave them a sense of comfort that Obama probably wouldn't have been able to impart on his own.
How much did your experience, doing things like canvassing, talking to people, organizing, being active, how much did that trigger your interest ultimately in journalism? And was that experience, like what I often find is what goes into good journalists, goes into good canvassers is often curiosity. And it was like there's certain people, especially these days, that if they would have heard that woman say that, they would have shut the door and said, "Oh, I will not be associated with you," whatever. Yeah. Whereas some people are like, I wonder why this person think, can I still persuade them? Can I still engage them? Curiosity. How much did that experience lead to your interest in journalism?
Yeah, I think that one did lead to the other in a way, maybe a slightly roundabout way, because, especially when I was a younger adult, it had never really even occurred to me that journalism was available to me as an option, because there was an ethos, especially in the undergraduate journalism departments in colleges, that to be a journalist required some kind of credentialing process, or that you had to want to professionally specialize in it in this very particular way. And that never appealed to me. So I was never somebody who had any kind of cultural or social affinity with, for example, the people who ran the mainline newspaper at the college. And so, what I did was over time, I had been, I guess, active in politics to the extent that that's possible for somebody of that age. I worked briefly in the governor's office in New Jersey when John Corzine was governor, just because they gave me a paid internship, which was kind of rare, but I got to sit in the office in the governor's mansion and just kind of, and really that was also driven by curiosity, because what I did, which most people would find incredibly boring and almost impossible to derive anything of any kind of enjoyment from, is I had to kind of maintain their databases around of local government throughout New Jersey. So elected officials in different municipalities who needed to be invited to certain functions, and I had to make sure all the information was correctly tabulated and stuff in these logs. And then I would have to call them and invite them to, for example, like the State of the State address at the State House in Trenton. And that stuff was just really interesting to me, because I sort of was preternaturally curious about just the minutia of American politics on a very granular level, and that was sort of a unique exposure to it. I ended up getting fired from that job for mysterious reasons, But yeah, so eventually, what happened was I just became. One summer I went to a conference because like at that time I was sort of. I didn't think that I was necessarily going to do journalism, but I wanted to do something that maybe was akin to journalism that I wouldn't necessarily articulate as journalism per se. So, for just sort of a personal project, I did like a early podcast type thing where I was interviewing politicians in Newark, New Jersey about gay marriage, which was then a pending issue before the legislature. And there was an interesting case in Newark where this guy, Ray Rice, no relation to the ex-football player, but Ray Rice was a state senator from New Jersey, represented Newark, and he had a son, Ray Rice Jr., who was on the city council in Newark, and they both had diametrically opposite views on gay marriage. Obviously, the older one was opposed it, and the younger one was for it. And so I thought that was sort of interesting dynamic because I was sort of, at that point I had gathered up some contacts with like New Jersey politicos, mostly Democrats. And I just wanted to explore it. So just on my own freelance sort of basis, I started just putting together a podcast on it. And I submitted it, and then I applied for an internship with This American Life, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it was one of the very early podcasts that made a big splash, hosted by Ira Glass, affiliated with NPR, where they do all kinds. I mean, it's sort of journalistic, sort of not, but I was interested in it. And so I submitted that, and they said, we don't have a spot for you, but this is really good. You should continue pursuing it. So I said, okay. And, one thing led to another. I think that summer I went to a conference in Washington, D.C. that was hosted by the Center for American Progress. And just by happenstance, they gave you a choice. Do you want to go? Like there was one day was the main conference that everybody went to. And Bill Clinton actually spoke that year, and I was able to briefly interview him just by shouting questions at him. And this was on my little recorder device that you still needed at that point because the phones weren't sophisticated enough to actually competently record stuff. And I got basically Bill Clinton to say that he supported gay marriage. And this was the first time that any president, you can go Google it if you'd like, 2009. And this was the first time that any president, former or sitting, had said that they supported gay marriage. And so I said, well, I have this what seems like a somewhat significant news item. I don't know what to do with it. And then sure enough, the Center for American Progress gave you an option to either go to the activism conference on the second day or the journalism conference. So I said, I better go to the journalism conference to see if I can talk to any journalists who might know what to do with this. And there's an editor from The Nation there, Richard Kim, and I raised this to him. He said, yeah, write it up. And so I wrote something for The Nation while, I was still in college, and then ended up working for The Nation after I graduated. And then that's sort of how the cookie crumbled, I guess. I don't know if people are interested in this backstory.
Well, no, and we're going to get into, everyone wants to talk the $40 billion package, Ukraine, the modern stuff. But I think it's interesting in getting to know who you are and politically how you started, where you got to. One person in the chat asked, and I'm going to bring it up before we get into the good stuff. Do you regret your support for Obama now?
Regret? I mean, no, not really. I think my reasoning at the time was defensible for me under the circumstances. So I don't know what use it would be to regret it. Obviously, as my political kind of convictions or predilections matured, I went beyond just merely engaging in politics by supporting one candidate and hoping he does well. I mean, that in office, that's sort of not really my role anymore. But I don't think it was indefensible at the time. I mean, my political, being was formulated really through the Iraq War. And this is sort of maybe a segue to the Ukraine subject, just because there's a continuity, I think, in a sense, in terms of the foreign policy dimensions of both of these issues. But growing up, basically George Bush was the only president that I knew of in the sense of directly experiencing him. I had like faint memories of Bill Clinton, but not enough to like have any firm opinions about anything that was going on really at that time. So because day after day, the Iraq War was so dominant in my political consciousness, and that was the signature initiative of George W. Bush and the Republican Party. I don't think my instincts were off in wanting the most viable alternative to that trajectory as represented by the Democratic Party. And in the field of candidates available, I think it was also defensible to want Obama over Hillary Clinton. And so, I think, given the depth of my understanding of politics at the time, the conclusion that I came to sort of just instinctively, I think was defensible still today. Although, what wouldn't be defensible is to just remain in that same orientation without widening my perspective as time goes on. And I've, tried to do that, and also obviously morphed into different roles that, including journalism, which obviously kind of puts me in a different vantage point.
To what do you attribute sort of independence of thought that you and others have shown in a wide range of areas, that you're willing to risk the accusation of, doing anything that could help Trump, doing things that, promoting Assad, promoting Putin, whatever the latest line is? I think Dan Crenshaw's answer to Marjorie Taylor Greene today was anybody who didn't vote for the 40 billion is auditioning for RT. That kind of nonsense.
Did he say that directly to her? Where was that?
Yes, he did. He did.
Okay.
On Twitter. And
Okay,
all she had done is he had said something in response about why it's good money spent, because he is, again, explicitly, these people are clueless in terms of just diplomacy. But, he said it's a proxy war against Russia, and we get to weaken Russia without an American soldier dying. We just get to whack a bunch of Ukrainians. So, woohoo. I mean, he actually put it that way, effectively. She responded to that saying, how is this in America's interest to be involved in this? And and that's all she said. She didn't attack him personally at all. I mean, there was plenty of personal attacks to be made on Crenshaw. She didn't do it from the right.
Yeah.
And Crenshaw responded with, I guess you're still auditioning for Russia today. So it's that, mindset. But there was a part of the left that was still the sort of what I call the anti-war, anti-empire, whatever sort of label people want to put on it, but come from the old historic skeptical of American foreign policy left that Obama was supposed to have represented in 2008 by opposing the Iraq war, whereas Hillary was the pro-Iraq war. He was we're going to do different trade deals, not do a bunch of bad trade deals. He said he was going to reverse NAFTA, a lot of things like that. And ultimately, a lot of that didn't come to fruition, and that's sort of a whole different debate. Why didn't that come to fruition? Was it something in Obama? Is it something about the nature of our government? Because a lot of Trump's promises on a lot of war and foreign policy also did not come to fruition.
Right.
I think the way Putin put it, he goes, I think they all mean well, but the men in gray suits run your country sooner or later. But
I think Putin has actually said something to the effect of, it really doesn't matter who's in office as far as we're concerned. The policy doesn't change.
And I don't know how much he's wrong. I mean, it was in the good interview series he did with Oliver Stone. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, frankly. But like for you, Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore, to some degree Tulsi Gabbard in the political space, represented this continuation of what was going all the way back, a long history of being a war skeptical, put it that way, sometimes anti-war, part of the left base, philosophically, politically, journalistically, etc. Yet we just had a vote on Ukraine where zero Democrat. I mean, the first one, at least, Tlaib and Omar voted no, but now they even dropped off. And it's like, where in the world has the anti-war left gone representationally? But you and others have kept it alive journalistically. What do you think led to that independence of thought when so many others are just on the war train?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's sort of farcical to think that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have like a passionate devotion to the idea of sending interminable amounts of weaponry to Ukraine. I mean, do you really think that animates their like passions? It's kind of a joke. I think there are a couple of,
wrong reasons, but sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a couple of dimensions to this. At least for me, number one is that, like I said, my coming of age politically was so dominated by the Iraq War that. Did I freeze?
No,
No, you're still going.
You look good.
Oh, okay. Looks like my screen froze for some reason.
Can you still hear us?
Yeah, I can still hear you. Okay, well, let's just continue then. Yeah, let me know if anything weird happens. Yeah, because my coming of age politically was so dominated by the Iraq War, foreign policy became a sort of like a lodestar for me in terms of how I evaluate politics. I think if your sense of what is worthy of prioritization politically hinges primarily on more cultural type issues, whether you're, at least using the current jargon, if you're pro woke or anti woke, and foreign policy is down the priority pyramid for you, if it's even on there at all, then you're much more likely to just flip back and forth between the fashionable cause of the day on foreign policy and not really have the wherewithal or the knowledge base to come up with any kind of countervailing views regarding the prevailing issue of the day. So that's one thing, which is why, I've noticed that.
Oh, there we go. No, now you're good. I was just about to interrupt you. Oh, he's gone.
Yeah, we lost him.
Robert, I hope he comes back.
Yeah. He may just exit. I mean, he has the invite, so he can link back in.
I'll bring him. Robert, I had a question about. Tell me about this. Like when they talk about whips, and when AOC was crying after she had to vote on, I think it was funding Israel. Was it the vote on the military package to Israel? She was crying, and she was seen crying after something, and then everyone's like she had to vote against her wishes, and she was crying because the Pelosi and the Dems whipped her into voting the right way. Do they actually do that? Like they say, if a Democrat votes out of line, we're gonna sanction you or do whatever we can politically to make your life hell?
No, they just ask. I mean, they can put pressure on you, but and the pressure is raising money, putting a primary opponent against you, not giving you the committee positions you want, things like that.
Okay,
but that's all.
Hey,
there we go.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened with the.
You said before you froze. You asked if you froze. Okay, now we were talking about AOC and Ilhan Omar, I believe, supporting, the only two who hadn't supported previously, now supporting this unanimous $40 billion.
It was Rashida Tlaib and Omar, I think, hadn't.
Yep.
I was just going to say that if you're, I don't know when I was cut off exactly, but I think if your sense of what is worthy of prioritization in the political domain hinges more on cultural issues on a day-to-day basis, or even, I guess, potentially economic issues, but anything other than foreign policy, I think you're more likely to just have a transient sense of what your convictions are in the foreign policy arena. And so that's kind of why I've noticed, especially since the Ukraine war started, that a lot of these media personalities, and I'm not going to name anyone in particular because, I don't instigate drama, but a lot of the media personalities who on many things I tend to agree with or be aligned with, who are, I guess, generally categorized in this, broadly speaking, anti-woke category. They're basically just a prong of the consensus now on Ukraine. Either they don't discuss it really, or they actively support it, depending on who exactly we're talking about. I know I'm generalizing, but I don't really want to get into the weeds of who in particular I'm referring to. And I think, that's partly a function of how, the culture war or whatever the kind of signature cultural issues are of the day informs their sense of their political orientation. And whereas for me, it's just different. I think, foreign policy has always struck me as something that I can't even really fully explain it other than the genesis of my political upbringing in the midst of the Iraq War. I would just have had this sense that, because I happen to live in this era in the world's sole military superpower, that therefore it's incumbent upon me to be extra diligent and pay extra mind to the foreign policy undertaken by the government of which I'm a citizen. I think that's sort of reasonable. I think actually Tulsi Gabbard, who you mentioned, has a similar take in terms of her presidential campaign. It was in 2020. It was one of the rare presidential campaigns that was oriented around foreign policy primarily. That's usually not the case unless there's a major war happening or something to that effect. So I think that's one part of it. And the same goes for these kind of left. I got, earlier today on Twitter, I call them lifestyle brand leftists, where what does it seem like really animates somebody like AOC the most? She can be cajoled into some sort of labor action, and like what happened, I think, with the Amazon organizing in New York recently. But you do sort of have to infer with her, and I think others in her cohort, that mainly what they really are impassioned by are these culture war type issues. And I think that's just it's automatically going to lend itself to a certain superficiality in their approach to politics, such that they could. I'm sure AOC in in the midterms later this year will be campaigning as this stalwart progressive, and she's going to stand up for all the blah 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 values, and she won't even perceive, or maybe she will, but she'll try to hide it or stifle it. But I think that she won't perceive any disconnect between her bandying herself around as this socialist or DSA endorsed superstar, and basically voting in favor of, as she did yesterday, for an enormous escalation in a U.S. proxy war. So now the U.S. is even more militarily and financially invested in this ever escalating conflict, which also in the vote also entailed affording Biden with ever more unilateral war-making powers. So I know maybe there's some convoluted argument that could be proffered to argue that is somehow consonant with her wider claimed ideological perspective as the self-proclaimed socialist. But I'm not sure what that argument would be.
Go ahead.
Mike, just one question so that you can clarify for people watching. I'm in Canada. I'm seeing, pictures of empty shelves in the States, baby food, a baby formula shortage. You're a journalist. I don't know if you're I don't know if you have to go on the ground to get that. Is this as real as it looks on social media? Is this an actual thing, or is it exceptional situations in certain stores being blown out of proportion that you know of?
Well, as far as baby formula, which has been coming up in the past few days, that's not a product that I would go out of my way to seek out. So I wouldn't have known about a shortage other than hearing about it through social media or through other anecdotal accounts. I have gone to, it's just at the grocery store on Sunday, and there are still these notices hanging on different aisles about shortages of certain products. Actually, a telling example for me personally was that in February I had a car problem, and I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I believe it or not, I was actually going to go cover the Ottawa stuff, and I was going to drive there. And my car essentially broke down in Scranton, Pennsylvania, right? So I had to go get it repaired at the local Firestone, auto body shop. And because of the supply chain problems, I guess at that point, it probably wasn't mostly about the supply chain as far as I was told by the repair guy. It was about truck shortages of truckers and truck drivers and trucks themselves. And I guess maybe that was combined with also actual supply shortages. But because of that, it took me. So the car broke down, I think, on February 20th, and I didn't get it back, or it wasn't completed until the repairs weren't completed until end of April. So basically, I was without a car for over 2 months or something.
Now,
that was okay for me actually, because I happened to have been abroad during much of that time. But if I needed a car on a regular basis, I would have been out of luck, because to get a new one, would have been astronomically expensive, as you might be aware if you've looked at the prices recently. I actually did briefly consider that, but it almost made no sense to get the prices were so mind-boggling that I almost didn't know how to make sense of it in terms of what would be the rational option, for getting an expensive repair versus getting a new one or a used one, etc. So yeah, I have seen some of these indicia of inflation stuff and supply chain stuff gone berserk, but not the baby Formula One.
Now, one of the things you've done a lot of is get out on the ground, wherever that's been. Throughout 2016 campaign, 2020, especially towards the end. Interesting reports out of Scranton. That was a sign that Biden was actually going to do a little bit better than expected in his old where he claimed ancestry. Wherever he may have politically grown up, but also you covered a lot of what was happening on the ground in the BLM riot context, or what's been labeled the BLM riot context. I guess the Seattle mayor called the Summer of Love, but particularly in Minneapolis, that a lot of the disparate impact was being felt by minority business owners, and in particular, and you're one of the few journalists who was covering that from that perspective, from that standpoint, not covering it from a let's highlight crime perspective, not covering it from a let's highlight police abuse. Let's instead, what happens to ordinary small little businesses that have their little shop that's now gone because of what happened? What inspired that desire to cover, and have you followed up with some of those folks that you talked to?
Well, really, it was largely just very simple journalistic desire, because that first week or so when the riots / protests first exploded in May and early June of 2020, I knew that I was never going to get the full story of what was actually going on as filtered through the media and activist class, in which the media is so fully intertwined, because of how zealously committed they were to what they perceived as the cause of the protest. Now, I don't think in many cases they could cogently articulate what that cause supposedly was, but regardless, they were all in on the perceived righteousness of what was going on. And even if you do think that it was a righteous, quote unquote, cause, you probably ought to be simultaneously aware that that's going to have certain distortive effects in terms of the accuracy or breadth of the information that's being transmitted to you. I really just, because when I saw that there were so many protests and riots happening in so many disparate areas, I got that kind of initial intuition that there was something historically unique going on, and therefore it was probably warranted for me to go out and try to experience it and report on it as much as I could. So I didn't consciously think to myself, I have to go track down the stories of these small businesses that were destroyed and see how they were affected. No, it was much more simple even than that. I just wanted to go and look around and talk to people. And so when you do that, and you go to these affected areas, almost inevitably you end up encountering some of these small businesses that have been, in many cases, just flat out ruined. And the sentiments of people affected by that, I found, were not being accurately represented in the media, whether that was just the progressive media, the mainstream media, which is like left or center left probably overall, and even the conservative media I thought was doing a poor job covering it, because in the case of the conservative media, you saw this meme going around, or this kind of untested assumption that in areas where there was major rioting, Trump is going to automatically benefit because he's the law and order candidate, right? So he's going to the riots are going to just kind of intrinsically redound to his electoral advantage. And that always struck me as probably not right. I think that was my intuition. And but on the other hand, the left or progressive media, they would be very much disinclined to amplify the perspectives of people who had been harmed in one way or another, indirectly or directly, by the riots aftermath, because their accounts wouldn't align with the predominant narrative either, as far as those left liberals were concerned. Because most of the time, the people who were affected in these areas were themselves minorities, particularly in Minneapolis, but all over the place. It's I remember the first time I went I went to Philadelphia, before I really set out for my nationwide trip, which is slightly later. But one of the big blowout weekends, I went to Philadelphia, where the National Guard had been called in, and I went to Kensington, which is a rough area. It's actually one of the wildest places. I don't know if you've ever been there, that you could go to anywhere. I've ever seen anywhere in the U.S. It's like it's just an open air drug market, essentially, with rows and rows and rows of people just camping, who have like residences set up on the street. It's very strange. I think most Americans probably are not aware that a place like that would even exist in the U.S. Skid Row-ish, I guess. But anyway, I went there, and there were National Guard deployed, full military fatigues with the assault rifles in tow, although they didn't have, they weren't loaded, but they were there for visibility purposes. And almost every person I spoke to, every black person I spoke to, I would say probably 9 times out of 10, if I would talk to a just ordinary black person in these areas about what they thought of the presence of the National Guard, they would be supportive. And it was interesting because they probably would be not anywhere near supportive of the police. They might not support the rioting, and they might not support the destruction, but they also wouldn't be just rah in favor of police back the blue, because they have, especially the older black people, have legacies of, I think, genuinely being harassed and probably wrongfully treated by the police at times throughout the ages. Philadelphia has a pretty grisly history of that as well.
Yeah.
Yes. So I guess there were incomplete or misleading narratives percolating from all segments of the political spectrum, that I thought maybe if I were to go and experience it firsthand to the best of my ability, that I could cut through it. So that was my basic instinct for doing it. And then, particularly in Minneapolis, even today, I'll occasionally get people contacting me who either see this Medium post that I did in July of 2020, or this long Twitter thread that I did. And they'll say, wow, how is it that I had no idea that the scope of the destruction was so intense in Minneapolis? Because really all I did was just go around and talk to people, interview people about what happened during the riots, how they experienced it, what they're feeling now, what happened during the peak of it, and take photos and so on. But for whatever reason, that very standard, uncomplicated reporting was seen as this revelation for a lot of people. So that tells you a lot about the biases that are very ingrained in the media ecosystem.
Well, revelatory. But first of all, Tracy's reporting on BLM riots was epic. But the question is this, Michael. I mean, you cover things just to show what's actually going on, and just to actually talk to minorities who, by the media's stance, are, totally against the government, totally against police. And then you talk to them and you find out they're not. And they, might not be so much on board with BLM as a movement given for what it's known for. Do you start getting pushback from the left, from the BLM supporters who say, we don't want you broadcasting to the world what's actually going on here because we've got a narrative to spin?
Well, yeah. I mean, I got a multifaceted pushback from the quote unquote left, broadly construed during that period, because they didn't like a number of aspects of my coverage. One thing that I would point out, because I was sort of interested from a sociological standpoint, was that much of the time, these protests, which were being portrayed in the media as just for racial justice, much of the time these protests were predominantly, or even at times universally, white. And even just pointing out that demographic fact, people found infuriating. And I'm not sure. I mean, I'm still not sure I understand why. Like, why is it so offensive and scandalous to point out just that obvious demographic reality? Like, I was in Upper East Side of Manhattan, so around Gracie Mansion, for a big protest. And I had been, I've seen a lot of protests in New York City, but that protest that I saw the first week or two of the George Floyd saga might have been the whitest protest I've ever seen in New York City. Which is like, okay, so whatever, like the ultimate thing that one might extrapolate from that, it is quite interesting. It is notable. It's worth noting. But even my noting it was seen as outraged by a lot of people. Another amazing example was I was in Chicago on Juneteenth, right?
Can you explain to those who might not know what Juneteenth is? And I'm
so
not going to be glib.
Yeah. Juneteenth was first inaugurated as a federal holiday last year, June of 2021. I actually think it's a good idea. I think I support the holiday. It's purports to commemorate the liberation of American slaves. On this, I think the idea is that on June 14th of 1860 something, Galveston, Texas released the final slaves. I don't think that was actually when slavery was abolished in the U.S., but it became sort of a regional holiday in Texas, and then spread outwards. And then as one of the kind of policy responses to the George Floyd stuff that I actually thought was reasonable and would have been reasonable even absent the George Floyd stuff, it was made into an official federal holiday in 2021. But in 2020, I was Juneteenth was still being celebrated, not as formally, but it was there were big events held all over the place, especially given the energy that had been ushered in by this protest movement. And so it's basically it's a Black American originated holiday, right? And so there were Juneteenth celebrations being held in Chicago. And so I was in the middle of downtown Chicago. Where was it exactly? I forget the exact neighborhood of Chicago, but it was a mixed/Black, maybe plurality neighborhood in Chicago, and there was a protest as part of one of these Juneteenth commemorations earlier in the day. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that at this march through Chicago, I think it was maybe, I'm not going to mess up the neighborhood because I'm not an expert in the topography of Chicago. But in Chicago, on Juneteenth, the police force that had been dispatched to monitor the protests and kind of trail the marchers and just be present and visible to enforce the law if anything were to go awry, the police force was more diverse than the protesters because the protesters were so predominantly white on Juneteenth in Chicago. And, again, that was just a factoid that struck me as very interesting. And I wanted to more fully comprehend the significance of, but people would get just so angry if you even mentioned it. Another thing that I think is, that's sort of funny, but less funny is that in Minneapolis, when I'd be going around to some of the most, riven areas from the violence, I would talk to shop owners who, whose exteriors of their shops were both boarded up, and they would have pleas to please not attack them. You'd go around and there would be like this apartment building on the where the windows of the shops below would be boarded up and would have spray paint on it. Children live here, please don't burn. Which is like, wow. I mean, this is a major American metropolis. But anyway, the shop owners told me I talked to a Somali shop owner of like a little grocery, right? And he said that the instigating protesters when the riots first broke out, and I guess protest is just sort of a misnomer. But the people who instigated that initial phase of the rioting in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis was the hub of it, and that's where everything originated. The ones who started doing the arson attacks and started wreaking the most havoc, they were white people. Not exclusively, but over time, because I had been to so many different cities and talked to so many different people about how the chronology of how the protests / riots materialized. So New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Seattle, Portland, and even smaller cities like Green Bay and Fort Wayne, Indiana, places where you wouldn't expect ever for a riot to happen. But for example, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, they had the biggest riots they ever had in their history, at least according to people who told me that was what they could recall, who had lived there their entire lives. But over time, you sort of notice a pattern, which is that the riots seem to develop with with ideological, maybe anarchist or really extreme left-wing type zealots who want to, foment some kind of, insurrection. I think that's sort of an overused word now, but I think that, if you are a diehard, thoroughgoing anarchist, a strain of thought in that school is to, as best as you can, eventually foment a genuine insurrection, so that the state could be, potentially overthrown. I don't know if they thought they were just going to get that far. But anyway, so at least in Minneapolis and some other places, it seemed like the chief instigators of the initial wave of violence with the arson attacks and the some more kind of elaborate violence were these ideological activists, predominantly white. And then, once there's this vacuum in the city where the police resources are being used up and they have to go, attend to certain, fires or incidents or whatever, at that point, order breaks down. And then the local population, which is predominantly Black, in certain of these areas, then they can go, do opportunistic looting. Because if all your friends are rushing into a Foot Locker, then you might as well just follow them, right? I thought that was, and that pattern seemed to repeat over and over again based on what I observed. And I hadn't seen anyone explain it that way, and so that's what I tried to do. I think I grant that there's some variation throughout the country, but I think in broad strokes that seemed to be how that initial phase of the rioting unfolded. And this is significant historically because, these were the most widespread and destructive riots in the U.S. since at least the 1960s. And they seem to have be more widespread geographically even than the 1960s. In the 1960s, there were some individual riots that were probably worse. But in terms of just how ubiquitous they were across parts of the country that you would never expect there to be any kind of tumult like this. It had some unique historical qualities that I thought were worth chronicling.
Now, I'm not asking you this question because you are a lefty, according to some. This is let's set aside.
Well, a lot of lefties don't accept that I'm a lefty. There's
no question about that because
I'm not that wedded to the label.
But here's my observation. Setting aside the traditional accusations of racism against the conservative Republican GOP side, we know those, you agree or disagree with them. What you're describing is what a lot of people are witnessing. It's this, on the left side of things, this white savior complex. You have more, demographically speaking, more white people protesting at Juneteenth, George Floyd. You have more white people at the same time simultaneously causing the havoc at these protests, because we saw it in real time. Like, it's not, there's looting. You're right. I mean, in certain inner city riots and wherever up unrest, you have looting, but you see the demographically sort of ethnically demographic protesting in support of the people they purport to be trying to help. You have the same different groups seemingly initiating the violence at these protests. And then in the middle, in the crosshairs, you have the actual ethnic minority demographic that all of these interests are supposed to be protecting, suffering the consequences of this. How do you explain this phenomenon from what is supposed to be protests for, in support of, but ultimately only causes harm to?
I think one of my motives to point out the curious demographic composition of many of these protests was that oftentimes in the popular discussion online and whatnot, or in the media, you'd see the riots / protests of 2020 being kind of blithely likened to the protests of the 1960s. And what they were referring to basically were, like, for example, in Newark, New Jersey, which is, where both sides of my family are from, there were the significant riots in 66, was it 67? Those riots came to be referred to as, like ghetto uprisings. That was sort of a more glamorous way to put it. But those riots were actually, spearheaded by the local population by and large, right? I mean, it was, blacks who were in many cases living under, deleterious, I guess, circumstances, who, one thing led to another, and they did do a lot of these rioting activities. And so I think just kind of putting them in the same category as if what happened in 2020 was just this seamless continuation of what happened in the 1960s missed a fundamental difference as to, what led to the actual riots. Because if destitute, impoverished people do an uprising against a genuinely abusive police force in the 60s, that has a different valence to it than a bunch of, ideologically committed, left-wing / anarchistic activists organizing amongst themselves online saying, oh, look, there's an opportunity here in Minneapolis. Let's flood in and try to wreak as much havoc as we can in hopes that it'll, lead to some sort of anarchist revolution. Those are wildly different scenarios. And so because in 2020, there was such an intense desire to portray the riots / protests in the most favorable possible light, it was kind of connected, I think, unjustifiably to this romanticized version of what happened in the 1960s. And I'm not saying like that somehow what happened in the 1960s was quote unquote good or better or whatever. It was just much different. And I think, this comparison was structured in a way to engender the same sympathy that one might have had for, blacks living under Jim Crow or something in the 60s. As though in 2020 it was just this, again, seamless continuation of before. Back to your point, I think it's worth thinking about what actually came of those protests / riots in a policy sense. What changed? Maybe not even just a policy sense. What changed tangibly that we could nail down with some precision as a result of what the New York Times famously declared was probably the biggest protest movement in U.S. history? That's a striking fact, and it seems true. Okay, so what came out of that? Well, you had a lot of sports teams that were kind of bludgeoned into changing their names and mascots. You had a lot of media organizations that had these internal coups where, the old guard was dislodged and the new journalists who had a different idea of what the ideal journalistic philosophy is take over in these like hostile, takeover attempts. You had a lot of jargon and new acronyms introduced that, the nonprofit sector adopted and the kind of professional activist class adopted. I wrote a piece that came out, I think in March for that new magazine Compact that's started by Sohrab Amari and Matthew Schmitz and Edwin Aponte, I think. Anyway, so they asked me if I wanted to be a contributing editor and write a piece for the launch of it. So I said, sure. And they gave me this assignment to look into what the Omidyar network has been up to. So Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, now a giant philanthropist who, among other things, funds First Look Media, which is the umbrella organization for The Intercept, et cetera. But one thing I looked into was his philanthropic network, and what sort of dispersals of monies he's been up to in the past, 5 or 6 years. Because, like many other people, including many affluent people, he was radicalized and heavily politicized under Trump. And after 2020, after that, riot period, he started donating tons of money to these different, racial justice inflected activist organizations. And I looked into one of them, which I think received, I think it was $150,000. So chump change in terms of his overall fortune, but, enough where you can, do maybe a half a year, a year's worth of work with that as a significant contribution if you're one of these organizations. And it turned out that the executive director of this organization that Omajar's entity gave $150,000 to was going around on TV and actually overtly saying explicitly, no equivocation, that the point of her organization was to defund the police. Like, she actually used that terminology. And then, we were later told that nobody was saying that, right? Or that it was just a fringe view or whatever. Whereas, this was one of the premier, basically new racial justice organizations that had money flooding into it after 2020, because a lot of people felt they had to, quote, do something. And if you're wealthy, then one of the things you can, quote, do is just give money into this nonprofit industrial complex where there's hardly any auditing, hardly any accountability mechanism to determine where the hell the money is even going or whose pockets it's lining. And so that was one of also the other results of the riots. You had a lot of corporate branding exercises that were undertaken. And, maybe aside from a couple of state level reforms, I think most of which were probably good. I'm of the mind that the U.S. was overly incarceral, especially from the 1980s onward. And, it is sort of a blight to have a prison population that is much bigger by percentage than even the height of the Soviet gulags, and that, especially with drug prohibition, people end up getting a lot of time in prison who never ought to have. And I'm also of the belief that, there are problems with American policing culture. Especially as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in New Jersey, and so granted, this issue is going to be much different for people who grew up in inner cities. But my experience and the experience of most of my contemporaries in a small town in northern New Jersey in the suburbs was that the police department, because of course in the U.S. every municipality has got to have its own police department, right? So they can collect taxes, so they can give the chief a ton of money as a salary. It's funny. I remember I looked up back in 2014, I was doing some sort of research on policing policy, and the chief of police in 2014 in Carlsbad, New Jersey, which is sort of like a tiny, it's an insignificant municipality in, is it either Passaic County? I think Passaic County, New Jersey, or he made more money just through seniority and accruing compensation over the years. His salary was higher than the vice president of the United States. So, I think there's a lot of kind of ingrained corruption amongst police in the U.S. and a lot of the transparency and, quote unquote accountability that's been imposed on them, I think, is probably for the better. The problem was reasonable policy recommendations as to how to improve police culture became so intertwined with these bizarre cultural neuroses. These hang-ups about speech codes, and somehow I got all connected with gender and gender identity and all this, and it just became an all-purpose youth social movement that may have been initially prompted by concerns about the police, but then spiraled outward to encompass everything that anybody under 30 thought was important, which tends to be dominated by identity-related issues nowadays. And so I think that was probably a disservice to the overriding objectives, such as it existed, to reform the police, because aside from, here and there, you'll get a maybe an example of something that was done. And I know on a federal level, I believe Rand Paul actually introduced a measure to reform policies around no-knock raids, which don't strike me as warranted on pretty much any instance. Especially without that led to the death of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. So aside from a couple of examples of something that is arguably positive that resulted policy-wise, mostly what happened was just a change in the cultural ether to be more censorious, to be more moralistic, to be more knee-jerk in denunciations of anybody who might deviate from certain contrived consensus, presuppositions. So, yeah.
I was going to say another example of that, where there was promises that they were going to use these policies to protect the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable ended up the most punished, was a lot of the pandemic policies. And you were also one of those people who broke from the institutional narrative at the point aspects of it no longer made common sense in the pandemic context. Not only in the sense that if being close to other people in a public setting spread the virus, then the mass protest would spread the virus. And yet suddenly, magically, the virus was like a woke virus. It disappeared at Walmart. It disappeared at a range of big corporations. It vanished.
Big box stores, but not mom and pop.
Exactly.
Stores.
The local store, that they knew right to attack there. But somehow, if it was, if it was politically correct rally, no problem. Politically incorrect rally, it would raid right away. So what led to being willing to challenge? Because I've been a little startled at what I would call almost like inquisitorial mindset, almost celebration of sort of if someone puts on a white lab coat, magically they have authority suddenly, and they can't make anything wrong. Even if there's someone like Fauci, whose history of how he handled AIDS was just a disaster. What led to your willingness to contest that? Because at the end of the day, you're upper middle class professional who can work from home anyway, who can get food delivered anyway, whose kids get tutors often anyway, not as big an impact. Your working class African American, say in certain parts of New York, who was stuck riding crowded subways because they decided to limit the number of subways traveling in the ways that made productive sense. What led you to be, those people that are disproportionately suffering from the virus, disproportionately suffering from the lockdown? Kids took major steps, as even Harvard's now admitting, major steps back in educational progress, overwhelmingly hurt poor and working class kids more than anybody. But what led to your willingness and discernment to spot that before a lot of other people did in the journalistic world?
Yeah, well, I mean, when COVID first arrived in earnest in March of 2020, because I am not somebody who has extensive knowledge of infectious disease or epidemiology or whatever. And I was talking to smart people at the time who were telling me that this was, a really serious problem. And I think it is a serious problem, even still, but that doesn't justify the barrage of utter irrationality that accompanied that problem. Because, it's like similar to 9/11. I mean, 9/11 was a serious event, right? Lots of people died. It was bad that some buildings were knocked down and, people's lives were disrupted. But, the badness of 9/11 as such doesn't justify the whole bevy of insanely irrational policies that were implemented as a consequence of 9/11 or in reaction to 9/11. It's a similar thing with COVID. So, although, I wasn't one of those people who was, from the very beginning, crusading against any form of lockdown or any form of restriction, just because I didn't know what the right solution was at the time. Like, I tried to be humble about it. And I tried to just be open-minded. I would read the people who were the more diehard skeptics and just understand. But in terms of like what I was personally going to advocate for, I thought that, given the exceptional circumstances, it probably made sense to at least, temporarily for at least the time abide by, generally speaking, the stay-at-home orders, and then figure things out shortly thereafter once we get a better hold of what's going on. So that's what I did. I think for maybe a month and a half or so, I just did the stay-at-home order as proclaimed by New Jersey, which entailed the park across the street from me in Jersey City being shuttered by order of the governor. Apparently it was better for people to pack onto the sidewalks when they wanted to get some air and not be cooped up in their apartments all day. So that seemed a little ridiculous. And actually, to this day, if you go look at like the notice laying out the park regulations, it still says you must wear a mask. I mean, nobody does anymore, nobody enforces it, but it's sort of like now an artifact from a bygone era. But even at the earliest part of COVID, when I was kind of at least begrudgingly willing to accept some restrictions, that, given the apparent gravity of the situation, I still said, and I said it publicly, and thought that, listen, this could be atrocious for civil liberties. So anybody who has any hint of fidelity to the preservation of civil liberties needs to be acutely mindful of how a lot of these things could go haywire. I mean, these are unprecedented actions being imposed by the government to require stay in their domiciles and so on and so forth. So I thought to myself, okay, look, even if I can't claim I have all the answers epidemiologically, I can hone in on aspects of the policies that are being imposed that could have troubling implications civil liberties wise. So the first thing I did after I kind of emerged from my accepted stay-at-home order was I got the Spectator magazine to write me a letter saying that I was an essential worker as a member of the media, which is like a joke. I mean, if the media are essential, then that category has no meaning. And what I was going to do was go to the state of Delaware, because I had read that there was a singular policy that had been imposed by executive fiat, as most of these policies were, by the governor of Delaware, John Carney, whereby anybody with an out-of-state license plate traveling on non-major roadways, so not like I-95 or something, but on one of these smaller roads throughout Delaware, could be subject to being pulled over by the police and fined, merely by dint of being in the state with an out-of-state license plate, which is, particularly ridiculous in the case of Delaware because it's a tiny state. So, I mean, there are plenty of people who live in Pennsylvania or live in Maryland or something, or Washington, D.C., or just constantly going in and out of Delaware just as an ordinary aspect of their jobs, right? So I went to Rehoboth Beach, and first I wanted to test to see if I would get pulled over because I have New Jersey license plates, right? And I never did. And I never had to brandish my letter that I was an essential worker, which is, when people talk about lockdown in the U.S., yeah, I mean, there were stay-at-home orders and stuff, and there were school closures and places of business were closed and stuff. But it's also worth being mindful that, like, for example, in Europe, to say nothing of Asia, there actually were stringent, lockdown orders where if you were doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing, there's a very good chance that you were going to be harshly penalized. And my girlfriend is actually lives in England, and her mother had to went to go visit my girlfriend's grandparents periodically because they needed help to get them goods and food and everything, and she at one point had to the mother had to evade the police. This is such a law-abiding person who would never dream of knowingly violating the law, but she had to evade the police because it was technically illegal to sit on a park bench outside and have food. Otherwise, you could be fined, which is why, when you see these, I don't know if you're aware of these controversies happening in the UK right now, but, Boris Johnson got a fine from the police for supposedly taking part in a birthday party, in June of 2020. And, a lot of that stems from, when they talk about lockdown, especially in England and Scotland and Wales, it was a real lockdown, right? Or realer than here, at least in most places. On the other hand, one of the more punitive lockdown measures, or at least you might put it in that category of policies that I could see, was this one in Delaware, which, if you're giving license to police to have a pretext to pull over basically anybody they want, or if you're expanding the range of people that the police have the authority to pull over, just if they can identify them as having an out-of-state license plate, then that drastically increases the number of the opportunities that citizens have to have an interaction with the police, and some percentage of those are probably going to go wrong, right? Where this is why we see these viral videos of a traffic stop where there's escalation in tensions, and then potentially it leads to some sort of violent event, right? So that had pretty dire civil liberties implications. Years ago, when I was a columnist for Vice, I would write about traffic law in the U.S. and how it sort of basically empowers the police to just totally vaporize your civil liberties on the roadways, which I don't think most people appreciate. I mean, you more or less have no rights whatsoever if you're behind the wheel of a car on a public roadway. The police can basically pull you over for any reason at any time. I actually represented myself in court once when I got a traffic ticket. I took it all the way to trial and basically got the officer who pulled me over in New Jersey to admit that. Or at least admit that was his understanding. Anyway,
they have magic smelling abilities. They can smell pot, miles away.
Well, that's actually, I think, one of the genuinely positive effects of marijuana becoming legal in many states now, including New Jersey, which I actually, as of last year, marijuana is now legal in New Jersey, which I really never thought I would see the day, because, when I was a teenager, police would who had nothing better to do would constantly, especially in these suburban towns, be constantly basically harassing kids by trying to bust them for marijuana, and they could just claim they smelled something, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it would nonetheless, it would give them license to do a traffic stop or pat you down or search your car. So one of the reasons why the police unions and the police lobbies were so vehemently against these legalization initiatives, it's not probably because they had any intrinsic problem with marijuana per se. It was because it took tools out of their toolkit to initiate these stops and to make arrests and distribute fines and such, which fills the municipal coffers with revenue. But anyway, in Delaware, so this was when I went and did that trip. For example, I was in Rehoboth Beach, and although I hadn't gotten pulled over, despite trying to almost like bait the police into doing it, I mean, I didn't go crazy on the roads or anything, but I kind of made myself visible just to test if it would result in me getting pulled over. But I would talk to a guy who worked in lived in Maryland, right over the border from Delaware, and then would drive 30 minutes north into Rehoboth Beach to work at a pizza place, and who told me that he was getting pulled over by the police just for going to his job. I mean, this is just his regular job, and this is not crazy for him to be in Delaware because it's a tiny state, so he happens to live over the border. And there are many examples of stuff like this where most journalists wouldn't think to, if not question the premise of it, at least question the civil liberties ramifications of it. I also did this in New Jersey, nearby to me, which is I just FOIA'd. And I did this I published this on Substack about a year ago, but I FOIA'd the Newark, New Jersey police for logs of whatever citations they might have issued pursuant to the emergency order of the governor or of the mayor around COVID. And a year went by. So I submitted this in around May or June of 2020. And then in May of last year, or June of last year, somewhere there, I finally got a CD-ROM in the mail. I almost think they wanted to get it out there because they went through a lot of trouble to burn the information onto a CD and send it to me. I actually didn't have a CD drive at the time, so I had to get one of these USB drives and put it in. And there was a huge, I don't have to remember the number off the top of my head, but there was a ton of citations issued in Newark, New Jersey by the police for the most petty of violations. like standing on a corner or just walking, or a lot of it seemed dystopic in terms of the nature of the violations that were cited. My understanding when I looked into it last was that a lot of these citations have been and it was so vague. I mean, it was just like for violated the violation cited was just violating the governor's emergency order or the mayor's emergency order. If you're empowering the police to do that, then you're empowering them to also exercise their subjective judgment about who deserves law enforcement scrutiny, which then comes with all kinds of other potential biases, right? I even talked to I think it was an Egyptian, somebody who was who immigrated to the U.S. from Egypt on asylum grounds and was working in Newark at this auto place. And one day, the police, I think it was in April of 2020, the police did a sweep of the entire block to see who was out there. And because he had just come one afternoon to like pick up some stuff from his store, he was cited. And he was actually somewhat disturbed and concerned by it because he thought it could jeopardize potentially his asylum claims. So these have a lot of downstream, effects potentially on people based on, what your situation is. I think a lot of these, at least those cases in Newark, were disposed at the discretion of the prosecutor and judge ultimately. But nonetheless, even if you're not penalized for that infraction per se, if you're exposed to the criminal justice system, it by its very nature makes it possible that you're going to get hit on something else, right? Or that you're liable to be to get into some kind of other trouble that's maybe ancillary to that initial infraction. So when you ask like what equipped me to do that, I don't know. I think a part of it was curiosity, which we were talking about earlier. I mean, I'm the type of person who actually is edified by reading these local and state regulatory schema that are decreed. Because this was like an unprecedented surge of heretofore, unthinkable powers that were being prescribed to the state. So that alone, I think, should warrant journalistic attention, even attention from citizens.
I'm going to bring this one up because hallelujah for your first time on the channel, Michael. I this would be satire ordinarily when one reads this, but I think hallelujah means it seriously. And I'm not trying to hallelujah. You should take pride in what you're posting. And if this is our veterans fought for our system of government, not a bunch of crybabies scared of a mask and a little needle. Doug Ford landslide. Doug Ford is Ontario premier.
Yeah.
Our veterans fought for our system of government. I think you mean freedom is what you mean by our system of government, not a bunch of crybabies scared of a mask. And let's flip this around. First of all, in a little needle, you can have cyanide. So it's not the delivery system that's the issue. It's what's being delivered. And some might flip that around and say they died not so that a bunch of crybabies could be scared of a coronavirus and the risks that go along with being alive, which necessarily involve the risk of getting sick.
Is this person calling for Doug Ford to be reelected by a landslide?
Yes, I believe the person is. How familiar with Canadian politics are you?
Somewhat. I tried to familiarize myself more than I had been when I was in Quebec for a while last fall. But my understanding is that Ontario was pretty much, in line with most of the predominant COVID policies, wasn't it?
Doug Ford tried to go full police state and require anyone out of their homes to show reasons for which they were out of their house, and the police force refused to abide by that. So Doug Ford is on borrowed.
So why does that person want Doug Ford?
I don't know. We have recurring people on the channel who I'll pull up the comments just to address them. But okay, look. I
was just going to say, before I lose this thought, going back to what your initial question that prompted me to do that soliloquy. Sorry if I was long-winded, but what sort of equips me or endows me with the ability to go against the grain on this subject and maybe other subjects. though I think part of it is just that is the curiosity, but also it's a disinterest in seeking validation from media peers, which really is the driving motivation for a lot of people in media. I mean, they are desperate to have the validation of their peers. They basically care about nothing more than that. They're more invested in that than they are getting the validation of readers or viewers, which is why, they are generally disconnected from the broad swath of the public. I also think that, in the case of something like COVID policy, if you were to challenge some of the premises underlying those policies in a kind of fulsome way, there's a good chance you were going to get automatically castigated as being like an anti-vaxxer, or and if you were an anti-vaxxer, that meant you were dangerously right-wing, and that meant you were probably affiliated with MAGA, and that you might have been at the Capitol on January 6th. And there's this whole slew of labels that kind of make you supposedly in line with contemporary right-wing extremism, and that's the worst thing you can be affiliated with by the lights of the contemporary media. So they do everything in their power to avoid even giving the appearance of that, but it does provide a disincentive for people to go to delve into certain topics that might result in them being subjected to that accusation. COVID was a great example of that. You had certain liberal critics who would get away with, challenging certain aspects of the irrationality, especially as time went on. There was a consensus that developed around how school closures were probably overdone and had too many negative side effects to have been justifiable. But if you kind of cross a certain line, you were probably going to be deplored as somehow right-wing extremist or pro-Trump, which is sort of ironic, because if there's anybody who was most single-handedly responsible for bringing about the vaccine on Earth, it was Donald Trump. And he was pretty, and he still he very consistently recommended that his followers get it. And yet, because the media needed to have this kind of fulcrum in their narrative where he was somehow fomenting anti-vax sentiment, they kind of just ignored that or glossed over it, which is odd still. I remember even this last summer, maybe in July of last year, there was this wave of hysteria around when the Delta variant happened about how Republicans weren't doing enough to implore their constituents to get vaccinated, and they're harboring anti-vaxxers and all this. And so I actually did the somewhat tedious work of looking up what every single Republican governor did in relation to vaccine distribution in 2021, and without any exception, all not only just facilitated their vaccine distribution programs, but they recommended that people get it. And many of them, even did the obligatory selfie where they're getting, tweeting out photos of themselves getting the injection itself. Because anti-vax at the time was this convenient way to erect an ideological enemy around which the media could revolve in opposition to. It almost didn't matter what the Republican governors did, because it was just assumed that because they're, this burgeoning right-wing insurrectionist fervor is bad, then that must be connected to the anti-vax sentiment, which is also bad. For people in the media, especially if you're reliant on the legitimization of media institutions for your sense of social acceptance and also for professional standing, then you're going to be hyper conscious of what might offend the sensibilities of people who have that power over you. Now, I don't have that problem, thankfully, in part because I've set up a arrangement for myself where I'm basically independent. I do write on occasion for different publications that are, mainstream media, you could say, but I'm not dependent on them for my, livelihood. Whereas, if you are, then that's going to dictate a lot of what you're able to cover, and it's also going to probably have subconscious effects on just your genuine beliefs. So yeah, and that goes, and I think that could be expanded as an explanation for why I've been able to charter a certain course on a whole variety of issues, from Russia Gate, now the Ukraine war, to COVID, to the riots and stuff, and to other issues.
Speaking of the Ukraine war, so you decided to go over to Poland to witness kind of the gray space grift, see it in action. I mean, we have arms going over there. We have no idea where they're going.
No.
Some of the arms don't appear to be useful actually in combat. It's not, if you wanted to be a Lord of War, War Dogs, Nicolas Cage, Jonas, kind of character from those films, there's no better time than probably to be in eastern Poland right now.
Yeah.
With the kind of money that's flushing through and now that's going to escalate off the charts. We went from 13 billion to 40 billion. We got land lease. I mean, it's just going to be flowing. Everybody's emptying everything to get those checks back up. But you talk about, like, for all the pressure, you can't question the pandemic public policy, or you're anti-science. You can't question whatever's happening with riots where you're racist. You can't question what happened with Russiagate, or you're a Trump apologist. But that all reaches a whole nother peak of cliquish behavior if you challenge or contest or question the defense industry, particularly in the West.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, it's worse in the West than it is in a lot of other places in terms of the ability to have independent media coverage of what the heck's happening in a foreign war. What led to you wanting to go over to Poland, and what was witnessing that, what I can only imagine is almost craziness in live time like?
Yeah, well, when the war broke out, I had a strong feeling that I wanted to do something other than just sitting around in my apartment in Jersey City, New Jersey. I felt like that wasn't kind of congruous with the imperatives of the events that were transpiring. But on the other hand, I didn't really feel it would be fruitful for me to, be this like war correspondent and go into Ukraine itself and like try to cover the aftermath of different, maybe Russian missile strikes or Ukrainian, counteroffensives or whatever, because, number one, I don't have, institutional backing where stuff can be arranged for me in that way. But number two, there was just a glut of that stuff anyway. And it doesn't seem that informative for the most part. Like, one of the big criticisms I would get from people online, granted, who already don't like me, but nonetheless, I think it's probably worth at least considering what they're saying is their supposed criticism of my journalistic approach. They'd be saying, you're not doing real journalism because you're not going to the war zone itself. So, I was actually on the physical border of Ukraine. I saw into Ukraine, so I saw the land of Ukraine. But it's true that I stayed in Poland because that Poland is the hub of the proxy war. I mean, that's where the U.S. is basing its operations to facilitate the disbursement of arms into Ukraine. I mean, there's some stuff going through other countries, but by and large, it's happening with Poland as the focal point, namely southeastern Poland. And there are more troops, U.S. troops now in Poland overall than there have been in decades. At least when I was there, their mission in other parts of the country, like Krakow, was just to provide reassurance by just being physically present in Poland. So it was sort of bizarre, but you'd have like units of, 19-year-olds walking around the touristy areas of Krakow, Poland, and just like, taking photos of each other and goofing around and stuff. And that was supposedly the fulfillment of their mission. And they didn't really have a whole lot to do otherwise. I mean, they would occasionally maybe do a little bit of training, but even some of the units didn't do training with the Polish military. That was for more of like the senior officers, as far as I could tell. I mean, the grunts were just kind of hanging out, seemingly. But in the southeast, particularly around Yeshiv, is where the U.S. has appropriated an airport to basically be the hub of these arms shipments. So when we talk about the proxy war being a U.S. enterprise, it really is the U.S. I mean, it's not NATO who's running these logistical operations in Yeshiv. It's not, Poland itself. It's Poland allowing an arrangement with the U.S. where the U.S. is running things. So even when you hear occasionally about Slovakia sent 25 radar systems or whatever, that is all being done by way of the U.S. as the prime mover here.
Actually, question here. I mean, we've heard of Canadian troops training people. I don't know if it's in Poland or in Ukraine. And there was also the rumor of a Canadian military person that was captured in a steel manufacturer. Robert, what were the details on that?
That a Canadian general, but according to Canada, he was no longer active, found in the steel factory in Mariupol as affiliated with the Azov battalion. And according to, again, this has not been confirmed even by the Russians, but what is out there in the rumor mill is that he was part of running a biolab, an off-the-books biolab in Mariupol. And according to the Russians, they had a big report today about the nature of these biological laboratories, and that they, were, they were what anybody who paid attention would know they were. They weren't just to protect the public health of Ukraine, put it that way. And, whether the Russian documents are reliable and trustworthy will be another debate for another time. But at least from an initial first glance, there's no reason to honestly to doubt them. I mean, I get it's Russia, so people are going to say you can ignore everything they say. But yeah, that's what I found fascinating is like you're right there in the middle of seeing the troops, of seeing some stuff that's like bad theater. I mean, like large parts of this war felt like bad theater. I mean, we got a president of Ukraine that, he's just going to retire, and Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie are going to co-produce reality TV shows for him. I mean, he literally played a character of pretending he was president. Now he's president, and now he's playing it. He's dressing like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Everything's all green.
It's kind of like it's the history. I mean, we have recurring examples of this now. I mean, didn't Trump end up bring back like the Apprentice boardroom scenario in the White House to tell people they were, you're fired and stuff. I mean,
it's escalating. It's just, but for it to be in a war, is still a little startling to me. And there's just aspects of this. I mean, even what I consider false flags events are not even done. I mean, the Ghost to Kiev. I mean, it's like you just hear that and be like, okay, that's really not probably true.
Well, I mean, I think, and it's similar to part of the intuition that I had and why I went to cover the riots in 2020. It's just that I knew that, the information being filtered out is going to be so agenda driven and so slanted that, to the best of my ability, I want to experience what I can firsthand to have a better understanding of the reality. And, a lot of journalists, they think in order to do real journalism covering the war, you have to, go be this, war correspondent flanked by, fixers and handlers and security guards. And you're going, stepping on rubble and stuff and talking to the victims. And there could be some value in that. I mean, the people who are directly affected inside Ukraine itself, they should have an ability to express what their experiences are, just like the riot victims in Minneapolis or whatever. But the fact that so many of them wouldn't even occur to them to go to Poland to cover the U.S. proxy war component. Because they don't think that the wisdom or the virtue of the U.S. proxy war is even a debatable proposition. It's just like, this arrangement whereby the U.S. military is orchestrating the biggest, even starting in March, I think it was the biggest infusion of weaponry into Europe since Harry Truman, at the beginning of the Cold War, was sending arms to Greece. And so, it was hardly covered from like an adversarial standpoint. Not that you have to be a obnoxious bomb thrower and go around challenging people, but you should at least cover things with a critical eye. And there was just none of that with regard to the U.S. military operations, because they thought that the moral parameters of the war had already been ordained, and then their coverage reflected that. So they wanted to go and just exhibit how horrible Russia is. And defend the war. I actually, when the invasion was launched, I actually, I knew I was going to be pressed constantly to condemn the war, and I actually did think it was condemnation worthy to have launched a preemptive war of aggression. Especially given how that could spiral into nuclear conflagration, and especially with Putin doing these threats of potential nuclear reprisal. I mean, I don't think there's any justification for that, and it is dangerous. But at the same time, I'm a citizen of the United States. I have most insight into how my own government works, and my own government is the one that is executing this ever-escalating proxy war with Russia, and so I want to have as much of an understanding of that as I can. And so I would go, around to these bases, try to talk to soldiers, talk to these civilian contractors who have been flooded in to provide logistical support for the erection of what are basically brand new military installations across Poland. I mean, one thing that was told to me is that in Rzeszów, Poland, which is about 60 or so miles from Ukraine, they're basically converting it into a Ramstein 2.0. And Ramstein is this air base in Germany that had been, basically the hub of a lot of military operations in Europe for decades, and that's what they're doing in Poland now. And so even if the war were to end tomorrow, you think that infrastructure is just going to be dismantled? No, of course not. They're going to find ways to keep it going and probably expand it, especially if they can say that they're doing it out of deterrence or whatever. And yeah, I mean, so you'd go into, if you want to go anywhere in the world right now, and I haven't been there now for about a month and a half or something, but if there's anywhere in the world that you could go right now, if you are an enterprising, prospective illicit arms trafficker, you should definitely go to Rzeszów, Poland, and the adjoining areas, because that's where these arms are being shipped into, and that's where you could encounter all kinds of shady. I mean, the shadiest people on earth are going into this. It's a little different now because I guess it's easier to get it to traverse Ukraine than it had been, because that was before. Well, I was there before the Russians had done a partial withdrawal from around the Kiev area and such. But even now, I'm sure it's somewhat similar in that you have this gigantic influx of some of the shadiest profiteers and spooks on earth.
Right. And you've got $40 billion worth of the newest military that's undoubtedly going to at some point fall into the wrong hands. But Mike,
CNN said that CNN quoted anonymous officials saying that to them, Ukraine is just a black hole in terms of where these weapons shipments are going. I mean, they have no insight at all into where they're going. There's people think, oh yeah, there's a scrupulously monitored chain of custody or something. No, I mean, they don't have no clue. Sorry.
And when you see weapons being sent over that don't have an apparent purpose, either because of lack of training of Ukrainian military personnel on those weapons, or the weapons are of an age, or other issues with them not being useful for this particular kind of battlefield, when I see arms laundering. That's what I see. I see like the defense industry can't send something to a bunch of blacklisted, say, countries or regions of war conflict, but they can send it to Ukraine or for Ukraine, and then it can get there with other middlemen. And at least some of the setting and scene you were describing was like something out of a Jean Le Carré novel, in that the kind of actors and participants that you could only witness by going there and being in the middle of it. And just getting the vibe of it, the texture of it, the way these people will talk so casually about what should be morally shocking to the conscience of the West, but sadly is not, in part because the media is not covering it or exposing it in the way you were.
Yeah, because the media sees nothing controversial about it, and they are so emotionally and ideologically, politically, financially, militarily invested in the battlefield victory of one quote side that dictates how they conceive of the entire conflict. So they're not even going to have be conscious of why it is that the U.S. war, the component that is the U.S. war effort, ought to be subject to scrutiny. I mean, every now and then you'll see kind of incremental examples of this, like CNN, as I mentioned, did something very uncharacteristic and actually had a very enlightening story by their standards in April sometime, when they reported that these. I think the headline was, "Where are the U.S. weapons in Ukraine going? No one knows." And so that was kind of a candid, admirably candid admission on their part, given that they probably feel strongly about the overall thrust of the war in terms of favoring Slavo-Ukrainian and whatever. But yeah, when you talk about I almost, part of me felt a little bad about how easy it was to come by some of this sketchy information, because really at times all I would have to do is go down from my hotel room and sit in the restaurant or bar area, and you just have these loudmouths yapping it up about how this guy who's connected to all these special ops colleagues has a direct line to the Ukrainian military general staff, and he's thinking about getting an air cargo plane sent in from Canada to deliver armor, and he's talking about how they can navigate the tax system of Poland to minimize the amount that they'll have to pay on VAT and all this, and he has just no compunction at all about just loudly yapping about all this stuff. And but meanwhile he's talking on Signal to somebody in the US. So he needs to encrypt, but maybe he just didn't think that there were anybody around who spoke English. But this is just one example of many. But I did a Substack on this guy because it was just so unbelievable. I tried, once this guy was flaunting how supposedly connected he was to the war effort, and was by his own loud admission seeking to profit off of it. I went to go just ask him who he was. Of course, he wouldn't tell me. And he claimed that he was just there on a purely humanitarian mission. Well, if you're there just on a purely humanitarian mission, shouldn't you be like boastful of that? Shouldn't you be more than happy to reveal who you are and what you're up to? And no, he wasn't at all. And it was just one of many characters that are slithering around that part of the world right now. If there was more of an appetite for covering the nitty gritty of who's profiting based on this war and who are they getting direction from, and what angles of personal benefit do they have they seized upon, then you could devote it would require a whole lot of journalistic resources devoted to covering that story, but you just don't really see it. So I tried to do a little bit of it. Just another thing is that was interesting was that I of course would overhear the chatter about how there were former U.S. Special Forces guys in Ukraine at the front lines on behalf of this NGO run by this guy, Chef Jose Andres. Just to provide just food throughout Ukraine, and this guy's been feted everywhere. He was at the during the White House Correspondents' Dinner weekend. He was at this house party hosted by the Atlantic, where of course the CIA director is there and Blinken is there, and all these other hotshots from the elite of DC. And he was there because he was like a guest of honor, right? And he said, and one of his top employees, didn't know that I was there, but of course I heard it, and then I asked them about it afterwards. We're saying how their whole operation is to have these former special forces guy at the front lines of Ukraine, and they didn't know what that meant in terms of combat. I mean, so like when you're supposedly giving money to one of these incredibly benevolent organizations that are just doing pure humanitarian aid, like for example, last weekend I saw something going around Twitter where a guy went to a restaurant in Dallas and got a $1 Ukraine fee tacked onto his restaurant bill that you had to proactively opt out of if you didn't want to pay the dollar.
What happens if you opt out of that? I mean, that's going to don't order a second course.
You're a Putin propagandist.
Then you're denounced for not standing with Ukraine. But it goes to this but the dollar apparently goes to this organization run by Chef Jose Andres in Ukraine. And, and the restaurant supposedly did it as this, act of joint solidarity of the, restaurants in the Dallas-Fort Worth area or something. And, what people don't realize is that, it's not like that dollar just goes to buying a loaf of bread or something. It goes to this whole apparatus of NGO kind of influence peddling and whatever, including a huge percentage that goes to these private security so-called security operations, which is a massive payday for a lot of these shady characters, flaunting their wares, how they're special forces and now they're on the front lines in Ukraine and keeping everyone safe. And maybe they do a little bit of combat on the side. I don't know. I mean, I can't prove that, but it wouldn't surprise me based on the, how they were just, how these, the presence of those guys was being discussed. And then when I was in UK until last week for about a month. And while I was there, an amazing story came out, and conveniently enough, it was on Friday at 10 p.m. local time of a bank holiday weekend on Easter. So it was like the ideal time to bury a story. But it came out that there were, British special forces on the ground in Ukraine, boots on the ground in Ukraine from a NATO country, and this just didn't cause that much. It barely got any attention at all. So I think just over time we're going to learn more. Like this, the true scope of the involvement, especially in the U.S., is going to be unveiled. And you saw that partially last week with the New York Times having these leaks about how crucial U.S. intelligence was and supposedly sinking the flagship Russian warship and killing generals and such. So it's only a matter of time before probably more and more of that comes out.
Michael, I don't know if you did a Substack on this, but look, and I don't know if it means anything or if it means more than what I think it means. I just noticed a lot of howitzers, M777, which is an odd number that's going to get people's attention because it's one off of M666, whatever. There's a lot of howitzers.
Wouldn't have got my attention for that reason, I have to say.
Well, no, but I need
somebody with your perspective to tell me that.
Well, you find connect. I don't pay attention to connection to numbers. I just know that people are going to see that. I just noticed America's giving howitzers and munitions are part of their 40 billion. Canada training how to use on howitzers is part of our contribution to this war. And then I just looked up who makes the howitzers. It's BAE Systems in the UK. Looked up the shareholders in BAE or BEA Systems. I forget which.
Yeah, BAE. Yeah.
BAE,
and they have US divisions as well.
Yeah, and it's BlackRock. And I don't know if BlackRock, which we're hearing is buying up real estate. Robert, Michael, I mean, I don't know any more about this. Am I connecting dots that don't have any connection, or is this part of the club that we are not a part of?
Well, I mean, it's very much a part of the military-industrial complex. I mean, it's why it is the power that it has. I mean, if you're a congressman, you retire, that's where you're going to go to work, or for a related kind of group, either Wall Street or the defense industry industry loosely writ large. You could add the surveillance and big tech subcomponents to that that are really kind of part and parcel of it. It's where the money and the power is, and it's why, in part, I mean, when J.D. Vance was considering whether to be opposed to the no-fly zone, he had to, he said, look, if this was, going up against the national security apparatus, deep state, whatever you want to call it, is risky. I mean, what happens? He makes a position. Every Rupert Murdoch publication takes a hit piece at him. Politico even does a bit of a hit piece after he wins the primary. Insists that it couldn't have anything to do with his opposition to the war, even though that's the only position that was significantly distinguished him from his two opponents, where he went from fifth to first. He went to first before Trump endorsed. Trump makes his broad kind of, hey, we should work for peace statement after he sees J.D. Vance surge in Ohio, not before. And he sees a correlation between the two, given the statements made by Donald Trump Jr. But the institutions know the same reason why 3/4 of Republicans are voting for $40 billion for Ukraine, when that would not, if that was a referendum, it would not pass more than 50% of Republican primary voters. And not because all of them are opposed to the war in Ukraine, but for some, just foreign aid is a no-go. And for some, it's why get involved in a foreign war? It's not our business. Who cares? Especially after the second Iraq war debacle. But the institutional Republican Party is still heavily controlled by the Romneys and Bushites and neocons. And this is where the think tanks are. This is why people like Dennis Prager are whoring for war. This is why people like Sebastian Gorka are whoring for war. It's that they don't want to offend real institutional weight in D.C. because they think, okay, I'm going to end up run out on a rail, because that's where the political, just look what's happening to Madison Cawthorn. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. He takes a very verbal, vocal stand against Zelensky, against getting involved, makes other statements about the moral corruption of D.C., and all of a sudden he's not only subject to criticism from the left with the insurrection allegation, but both senators in North Carolina, both Republicans, Burr, who was one of the biggest inside traders in history, he and his brother are still under criminal investigation in New York. Probably nothing will happen because he serves on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is basically the CIA's representative in the Senate. I mean, that was supposed to regulate the intelligence community, not be the intelligence community's representative. But that's the way it is. And Senator Tom Tillis is the same. So the defense industry, I mean, there's a reason why Eisenhower did his farewell speech saying this is a problem. I mean, this was a guy who helped build this in part. And he was like, well, hold on a second. This is probably going to get out of hand. And it is. And now we're seeing the consequences of it. But I thought your reporting in Poland was great. It reminded me of not only the Jean-Luc Carré novels, but I can't remember the name of the movie. But there's a movie with Mel Gibson describing the collapse in maybe it's Indonesia. It's one of the Southeast Asia countries. He's the actor portraying a journalist who lived it, who it's the same kind of scene. You're seeing this scene of British journalists in these bars, and there's just a certain mindset that you're like, where does that come from? But it's really prevalent and pervasive in this conflict. But
thank you. I mean, and, a lot of it was just strange because so many people were so angry about it. It was sort of similar to the riot reporting in that sense, in that just people were angry about the mere fact of me being there, and they didn't like, on the one hand, because there's a sort of there's a faction of these security state apparatchiks who some are anonymous online, some aren't, who have this running joke about how idiotic it was for me to just take some photos of some U.S. military installations that I came across, because how is that a story? Number one is what the criticism will be, but then it'll also be coupled with that I was somehow compromising national security. So they kind of don't seem to be able to get it straight what the supposed problem was. Malcolm Nance, who's this deranged former MSNBC analyst, before he shipped off supposedly to Ukraine to take up arms, although he seems to just be in a hotel or something in Lviv doing nothing. But he, because I took photos of some of these installations around Poland, he was calling on the Polish military police to throw me into the ground and arrest me for espionage. This was a guy who was actually on TV and had some sort of had some semblance of a platform. But there's other people who had other criticisms. Just before I forget, on the point of the $40 billion that was passed yesterday, 57 Republicans voted against it. But a thought that I immediately had when I saw that was how many Republicans are voting against this on principle, meaning they don't think that it's prudent or sound to send arms to Ukraine, and how many have procedural objections or technical objections. And sure enough, this speech from Chip Roy, the Texas Republican congressman, was going around where he spoke on the floor yesterday evening and was saying, look, we only got this bill at 3:00 in the afternoon, and now it's 9:30 and we have to vote and we can't even review it. And which is obviously a legitimate point. I mean, if there should be ought to be in theory ample time to legislatively review what you're voting on before you're rushed onto the floor. But I asked his communications person, is this and Chip Roy ultimately did vote. He was one of the 57 who voted against it. And I asked his communications person, is this about the principle of aid to Ukraine, or is it a procedural thing? And he said it was a procedural thing. Meaning, and he had, Chip Roy had an article that he did, an op-ed in The Hill from a few days ago where he's saying, look, there needs to be more of a plan. Biden needs to work more with Congress or something on, telling us where the money's going to go, stuff to that effect. But I would say probably maybe around half, if not more, of the Republicans who did vote against it yesterday, probably if you dig down to their position, would go out of their way to affirm that, of course, we support the sending of arms to Ukraine. It's just we don't like the manner in which it's being done. And I think, it's probably a relatively smaller percentage would actually have a problem with it in principle, which doesn't really give one much confidence that there actually is this major upswell of anti-war sentiment within the Republican Party. It's just that, within a certain faction of the Republican Party, you can kind of oppose something on the ground of Biden doing it and the Democrats doing it, and just sort of gin up that partisan reflex rather than develop a actual intelligible position that addresses the substance of what you're voting on.
Well, one thing is clear: the public sentiment is clearly not reflected in the political elite performance. So, but now I believe I'm being summoned for reasons that are beyond my control. There's a kid who's still down here, but I want to bring up one question, which is from Good Logic. And at first, I thought it was supposed to be a joke, but I think he thinks that 2,000 mules might be verboten terminology on the YouTubes. Has 2,000 jackasses influenced Michael's perspective about? See, that's the F word's joke. Joe's another lawyer on the channel. The F word is more serious than mules. Have you seen 2,000 Mules, and what do you think about it?
I haven't seen it. I'm not a huge fan of the Dinesh D'Souza filmography. I reviewed earlier productions of his back during the Obama era, and was not especially impressed when he said, he basically did a whole movie in 2012, which I think it was called Obama's America, which basically, frantically was warning us that if Obama won and Mitt Romney lost, so if Mitt Romney did not become president in 2012, then America was totally done for and would descend into like apocalyptic desolation. And, I think it was, let's say, a bit overwrought. No, I haven't seen this latest movie. I think Robert and I did a talk on election fraud stuff shortly after the 2020 election, and I don't. When people are putting that issue to me, they have to be specific about what they're identifying as a problem, because when people say stuff is rigged, sometimes they're just talking in broad strokes about how they think that the system was unfair and Trump was disadvantaged by media bias and big tech and all that. And I think those are largely legitimate points. But then there's sort of like a blurry line between that in terms of how they put it, between that and actual physical election fraud, which for the most part I don't think has been amply substantiated to the point where I would consider myself a proponent of that theory. Although I haven't seen the movie.
You might have.
I'm offended that I wasn't invited to the premiere at Mar-a-Lago.
Premiere Mar-a-Lago. A lot of us weren't invited to the premiere of Mar-a-Lago. Well,
I was invited. I just couldn't make it down. I have too many family commitments. I'm joking, people. I was not invited. Robert and I were going to do a live thing on Viva Barnes Law merged with Rumble, but it didn't pan out. But no, Mike, you should go watch it. Sorry, Robert, I cut you off.
Oh yeah, no problem. Well, yeah, no, I was just going to say. As our sort of exit question, where can people find you? And where can they follow you? Not only social media. I know you're an editor at the new publication, but also you have the Substack. Where can people follow you if they want an independent perspective on a lot of these topics? And I think you've done fantastic work. We have different political perspectives, but you've done a lot of very important value that frankly nobody else is doing. Nobody's going on the ground, and nobody went on the ground in the way you did in Minneapolis. Nobody's going on the ground in Poland like they should be, because that's where the real war is being waged.
I was even on the ground during the 2020 election in Atlanta, in one of the big hotspots that was supposedly rife with fraud, and that led me to certain conclusions that maybe were not as friendly received by certain people on the right, but that's okay. Just Substack is a good thing to subscribe to, mtracy.substack.com. And then Twitter, just mtracy on Twitter, where I post pretty much everything. But those are basically the two main places to see everything I'm doing.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Now my kid has found his way into. I got a box of fishing lures from a company called Hard Tackle, and he's found his way into them. Just got to make sure he doesn't find the ones with hooks in them. So far he's got the rubber things. Okay, so
Carlos, maybe you should go and handle that.
Yeah, he'll learn the hard way. I will He found that one. Okay, good. I'm going to pin your links in the pinned comment, Michael. It's very interesting. I do think you have to go watch 2000 Mules, even if it's only to disregard it afterwards. But it's more data, even if you write it off, is still better than less. So, I think it's worth the watch. But this has been great. Look, I did not know you were what some people call a lefty, and now I don't know what that means anymore. But it's interesting.
Well, I mean, some people call me a fascist as well. So,
well, that's it. Hey, some people call me a hard right extremist. So, Michael, we'll be in touch. This is fantastic. All three of us stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the chat, thank you as always. And I'll be live tomorrow. Apparently, there's been some. 1 second, sir. 1 second. Apparently, there's been some news with a Canadian guy who's walking across Canada. I don't know if the news is true yet. I'm going to go look it up. But Michael, stick around. Robert, stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the chat. See you tomorrow.